Hello, and welcome to the Not a Cast podcast, the one true chapter by chapter podcast going through A Song of Ice and Fire one chapter a week. I'm one of your hosts, Jeff, better as Britta B. Fish.
And I'm your other host, Emmett, better known as Poor Quentin.
And welcome to the 112th episode of the Not a Cast titled The Second Wish, an analysis of A Clash of Kings Aria VIII, in which Tywin, the lion loser Lannister, marches west, and Arya whispers another name to Jaqen H'ghar, only to regret it far, far too late.
And we're very happy to welcome back for this episode. You may know her from her writing at Hypable, or from her podcast work on Vassals of Kingsgrave and Jewish Fangirls, or from her excellent appearance on our own episode on A Game of Thrones Sansa 6. Please welcome back to the Nauticast, McCall. Thanks so much for coming on.
Of course. I'm so happy to be here.
We are so thrilled that you've come back. I've listened to that Sansa episodes a lot of times, just not because I'm a narcissist, not because I'm a total narcissist, and I like to listen to my own voice. I'm listening for you, McCall, is what I'm trying to say. I listen for your insights, not to hear myself do the synopsis on Sansa one more time. But no,
same. Sometimes I go through and I'm like, damn, that was a smart thing to say.
It truly is. And we really are excited to have you back and welcome back with us. It's really, really awesome.
You.
So, as always, this episode is brought to you by our small council, our Hand of the King Wolfman Zach, Grand Maester Tim Bob, Lord Commander of the King's Guard Mark N, Lord Travis, Master of Ships and Word of the Waves, Sir Keith J, Master of Whisperers, Lord Philip the Merciful, Master of Laws, Archmaester June, Healer of the Lesser Poxes, Ragged Michael, Ward of the North, Nelson the Hammer, Prince of Dragonscone, Scarlet, the Other Woman and Mistress of Whisperers, Lord Micah, Ward of the West, the Kraken's Bane, Lord James, the Gem that was promised, the High Bearded Priest, Lord Jake Assistant to the Hand of the King, Lady Zine of Lyrium, Hedrigal, Captain of the Airship Arrogance, His Grace's High Inquisitor, Sir Frank B, Sir Jasper the Cruel, the King's Justice, Lawrence, Prince of Dorne, Kelly, Ward of the East and Mistress of Old Bay of Crabs, Steve the Steadfast, Master of Hounds, the Blue Winter Rose, Knight of High Garden, Lady Stephanie, Lord Anonymous, Lord Carlos, Lord Andrew, the Priest, Lord Andrew the Restless, the Priest of the Drowned God, the King's Cook, Noli Oli, Master of Cannoli, Sir Sorcedelica, Prince Matthew of House Targaryen, Proud Soy Boy of Summerhall, Defender of the Fifth Book, and Swing Dancer with Dragons, Sir K.W. Dent, Elsie the Blackwood Guard, and Batman of the Seven Kingdoms, Lord Pension for Nostalgia, Queer Alex, Rainbow Commander of the Ladies and Gentle Thems, Lord Quint Esquire, Master of Absolutely Positively not serving as a spy for several unnamed High Lords and Ladies in order to further the secret Blackfire-style conspiracy to overthrow the oppressive small council. Haldover, the waiter for T-Wow, A.A. Ron, Dampere, Prophet of the Forsaken, and High Priest of Euron Crozai, Lieutenant Glenn, Lord of H-Town, Veneras of House Colgarian, the First for Name, Princess of Dragonstone, Mr. Svart, the Overlord, Queen of the Pencils, the Eraser, the First Draft, Queen of Monochrome, Devotee, the Great Game of Thrones, Portius of the Realm, Lady Reels of the Seven Kingdoms, Blender Paints, and Maker of Drawings, Shama the Slayer, Lord Adam T, Lady Alexander of Tarth, Sir Christoph Logos, Bloody Scorpion of the Redfield, Defender of the Letter of Kin, and the Wolverine of House Corgoyle, Lady Elizabeth, Mistress of Horse-Faced Lesbians, Sir Josh Snow, Bastard Bounty Hunter of the North, Surveyor, Chief of Parties in the Frozen Wastes, Lord Peter, Lady Ashley, Lady Raj, Mistress of Horse, the Dead Shepherd Reborn, Preacher of the Poor Fellows, Marshal Harrison absent, shipwrecked in the JHC, and our three newest members of the Small Council. Again, three newest members of the Small Council. Amazing, awesome. Thank you all very much. Grave Rob Stark, the Cadaver. The Cadaver is what I was going to. Grave Rob Stark, the Cadaver King and Horror of Harrenhal. Hedrigal, Captain of the Airship Arrogance, who rejoins the Small Council after a voyage across the Narrow Sea to find himself. And finally, Lord George. Sorry, I just have to get this off my chest, and I fear that if I just don't come out and say it now, I'm going to chicken out again. So here goes. I actually find Karth Quaithe to be a wonderful character, and Karth is probably my favorite location in the whole series. Why am I reading this? I've just been too afraid to admit it out of fear of what my co-host Emmett would think of me. There, I feel so relieved. There, I finally feel relieved to finally admit it. Anyway, where was I? Oh, yeah. Lord George R.R. Michael. Thank you, counselors, very much.
The taste of corruption. How is it, Jeff? Does it taste
bitter.
like ashes in your mouth?
It tastes like communism.
Thank you so much to all our counselors, as always, and a special welcome to our new ones, especially welcome back to Hedrigal, and beautiful work, Lord George R.R. Michael, in making Jeff say all of that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you all very much, and welcome. Our spoiler wing is to be saying all episodes, but potentially talking about all published books. That is the 5 novels, 3 Duncan novellas, histories, interviews, the Wins Winner sample chapters, as well as Game of Thrones, the TV show. Anything and everything.
Our question this week comes from Sir Michael Mertens, a High Lord, who asks, my question was about how men like Gregor and his crew find each other. Does such evil find each other? Do they change one another? Is it rotting from the top down? That's definitely a very interesting question. What do you make of that, Jeff? In regards Gregor and specifically, or more generally, how does a crew like this get assembled?
I think can be nature. I think it can also be nurture. I think one of the things I was thinking about this question is how after Gregor Clegane dies, how all the Mountains Men still stick together afterwards. So their central figure is gone, so he's died, but they're still hanging out up in the Riverlands. And then after we know that Gregor Clegane has died at some level due to Oberyn's blade after their duel in a storm of swords, they do end up continuing to stick together. They end up going over to Braavos. Some of them do. Some of them end up in Maidenpool. They're kicked out of Harrenhal. So I do think that there is an element that they were potentially recruited by Gregor Clegane, but they formed a bond of brotherhood in battle and in war crimes, definitely. And so I think like the question is whether they find each other. That's a good question. I feel like yes, and for some of them, some of the more brutal ones probably all kind of like glom together like flies on shit, but I think other ones were just kind of like brought in from the main Lannister host, because a lot of these guys are all just Westermen, or they seem like small folk from the Westerlands who got kind of brought together into one army. Anyways, what did you think, McCall, about this question? Did they all kind of join together, or were they kind of brought together, or they kind of joined on and went their own separate ways?
I mean, that's kind of like one of the central questions of good and evil, right? Like, let me just rustle up an answer there for you. But I mean, I think evil is sticky, and I think that is why a lot of the bad guys get lumped together. It's easy to do that, just because of Arya's prayer, and it is so like verbally, pleasant in a weird way to say. But that's also why the ones who are still evil but slightly less bad stand out. Like the guy with the foul language who will give you an extra piece of bread. Yeah, there you go. That's his name.
That's shit mouth right there.
Yeah, I think that it really definitely like the true evil sticks together and amplifies itself. And then other people are, kind of like glued on top of the thing. And then, if they're fortunate, then they get to, go off and be like just following orders Nazis. And people are like, oh, but he's not such a bad guy, really. It's not an excuse, is what I'm saying, for, bad company. It's not an excuse for evil behavior.
I think in practical terms, Gregor and his men, their job isn't just to be evil. It's very specifically to forage on behalf of the Lannister army. So it's a question of finding men willing to do that. Who go out and kill the equivalent of the people you knew back home. Go out and murder and rape them and betray them and take their coin and torture them. And I think it's just a question of percentage. Like there's 20,000 men in that army. Are there 300 men willing to do that? Probably. Mm-hmm. So it's a question of each individual unit commander who knows who those men are. And I guarantee they do. They know who the 2 or 3 men are that everyone else is a little about, who's proven willing to do things to civilians that the rest aren't. And when Tywin comes around or Gregor comes around asking for those names get offered up. And then I think the legend builds on itself. Gregor Clegane becomes a figure of myth in and of himself. And you want to be with him if you want to be like him, if you want to be part of what goes in his path. And Tywin feeds that flame as well. And you attract other beasts like Vargo Hoat and the Bloody Mummers. But it starts with that structure. And it starts with everyone being aware of it. Because, I don't think there's any chance involved here. I think Adam Marbrand and every other nice-faced Lannister commander who wasn't like Gregor Clegane gave names to Gregor Clegane of the 3 or 4 guys who would join his command. And that's where that company comes from. And in a way, it is where they put their evil. And so they don't have to think about it anymore. Adam Marbrand gets to go, well, none of my men are like that. Because the men of mine who were like that, I shipped off to Gregor Clegane
right, exactly.
and Amory Lorch. It's like the Night's Watch in a way, almost kind of in reverse. But it's the way you put all your evil and all the people you don't want to think about in your nice golden shining lion Lannister army to do the dirty work that you also don't want to think about. And so I think it's hard to reduce it to either the individual agency of these men or their commanders who know this work needs to be done for their army to be what it is, but don't want to think about it or do it too much themselves. And I think those 2 feed on each other. And the more kind of ontological question of evil, I think, is obviously difficult to address. But I think the point is structurally, non-monsters take part in this. make this kind of crew possible, because I don't think they just drift together. I think you have commanders. I think the answer is that other commanders make this happen.
Mm-hmm. And one of the people in our chat, for those of you who are watching live on our live stream, Guilty Undertaker, brought up the idea that Tywin said at one point in the narrative, I think it was in a Game of Thrones, that there's a tool for every task. So there's always someone who can fulfill that idea of like doing the reaving and raping, and the Adam Marbrands who could do the scouting and the noble work and ride ahead of the Lannister army and never, with your beautiful Fabio-like hair flowing in the breeze,
Right. And you find your scouts, you find your archers, and you find your foragers, which is what they call them. But this is it's a necessary skill to keep this kind of army in motion, or so they keep telling themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you so much, Michael, for the question. If you'd like to ask us questions, we have to answer here on the Nauticast podcast. You're welcome to become a Sworn Sword or higher level patron over at patreon.com/NauticastASOIAF, where you can find show notes, access to our Nauta Slack at our 2 highest levels, and 9 bonus Fever Dream episodes, and 27 monthly A Song of Ice and Fire bonus episodes.
Mm-hmm. And yes, like the first part of 4 parts on our 4-part series on The Winds Winner, The Forsaken, which is coming to all of our poor fellow and above patrons in the last week of May. So check us out if you're not already at patreon.com/ASOAF. For you patrons who are already members of ours, stay tuned. But enough about Patreon. When we last checked in with Arya, she'd been put to work in Harrenhal, had listened to a hilarious story by Chiswick, and then sicked Jaqen H'ghar on him for it. Let's find out what happens to Arya in this horror show of a synopsis of A Clash of Kings, Aria 8. We're welcome back to Harrenhal with Tywin Lannister and his army of war criminals who deserve tribunal justice, every last goddamn one of them, preparing to depart. All the combat service support elements for Tywin's army get the army ready to go with preventative maintenance checks and services, inventorying the property books and submitting them in G Army, and conducting motor stables on Tywin's rolling stock. About 10 of you probably understood that reference, and that makes me more happy than you can ever imagine. The noise was a swelling tide, horses blowing and whickering, lords shouting commands, men-at-arms trading curses, camp followers squabbling. Lord Tywin Lannister was marching at last. The first element to SP Fob Harrenhal was Sir Ginger Fabio, a.k.a. Adam Marbrand, Tywin's trusted reconnaissance, surveillance, and target acquisition squadron commander. Sir Fabio rolls out atop his red horse with his long red hair streaming in the breeze. He was one of Tywin's best horsemen and swordsmen, as Wiese explains to Arya. I hope he dies, Arya thought as she watched him ride out of the gate, his men streaming after him in a double column. I hope they all die. I just love that. I just love how Arya does that. It just makes me laugh every single time. Arya knew that these guys were off to fight her brother Robb, who had won a smashing victory out west. Fuck yeah, Robb. Though what that victory was isn't precisely known by the grunts in Harrenhal. They only know that Robb had done something big, and now Tywin's goons were getting ready to march. As for Arya, Wiese has her running messages all over the castle of Harrenhal. Arya feels tempted to escape until Wiese tells her and all of his charges that he'll probably turn them over to Vargo Hoat to have their limbs cut off if they attempt to escape. As for those messages, Wiese probably thought Arya couldn't read, so he sends the missives off with Arya unsealed. And like a good spy, Arya reads every last letter. Sadly, there's no real information of interest, just logistics work. Though one letter was a demand for a knight to repay his gambling debt back to Wiese. The knight couldn't read the letter, I know how you feel about that, buddy, and tells Arya to read the letter for him. She does, and the knight attempts to hit Arya. She ducks away from the blow, steals a silver-banded drinking horn from the knight's horse, and runs away before being caught. When she gave the horn to Wiese, he told her that a smart little weasel like her deserves a reward. I've got my eye on a plump crisp capon to sup on tonight. We'll share it, me and you. You'll like that. Ah, yum. I can't wait for Arya to enjoy some capon later this chapter. As Arya traipses all over Harrenhal delivering Wiese's letters, she tries to find Jaqen H'ghar. She wants to give him another name, but she can't find him due to all of the chaos. Finally, she asks a soldier at a gate about it, and he reports that Amory Lorch and his men are staying put at Harrenhal. And congratulations are in order. Sir Amory Lorch is being promoted in order to become the Castellan of Harrenhal. Hooray for Sir Amory! But also Vargo Hoat was sticking around Harrenhal too. And Amory and Vargo hate each other, so they're probably trying to kill each other. It's a joke. It's funny. It's not. Otherwise, the Mountainous boys were leaving Harrenhal too. So Arya would have to act fast in order for Jaqen to get him or one of his boys. But then Wiese orders Arya to head over to the armor. Wiese orders Arya to head over to the armory to let Luke and the armorer know that Sir Lionel needed a sword. P.S. Sir Lionel may be Sir Lionel Frey, one of Jenna Lannister's sons. Just a little bit of trivia for you. Wiese gives her Lionel's maker's mark. One more time. Weese gives her Lionel's mark for his sword, and she heads off to the armory, finding a bunch of shirtless, burly bros hammering and sweating in the heat. When she spied Gendry, his bare chest was slick with sweat, but the blue eyes under the heavy black hair had the stubborn look she remembered. Arya didn't know that she even wanted to talk to him. It was his fault that they'd all been caught. She asks Gendry about getting a new sword for Lionel and where she can find Lucan, but Gendry pulls her aside and tells her that Hot Pie asked whether Arya had yelled Winterfell during the battle at God's Eye. Arya denies it, but Gendry knows the truth. He had covered for Arya with Hot Pie by telling Pie Boy that Arya had shouted, "Go to hell!" And Arya needs to remember this if Hot Pie asks him about it. "I will," she said, even though she thought "go to hell" was a stupid thing to say. She didn't dare tell Hot Pie who she really was. Maybe I should say Hot Pie's named Jaqen. A little disturbing. But then Gendry goes and gets Lucan. Lucan gives Arya a new longsword, which Arya carries across the yard, liking the weight and balance of the sword, even if it wasn't like Needle. Still, she's starting to recover some of herself as she thinks that she's feeling less like a mouse these days. Arya sees the open gate and wonders about whether she just might slip out of Harrenhal, claiming that she needed a new horse for Sir Lionel. The stable boys wouldn't be able to read the letter. She could take the horse, the sword, and roll out, and she'd have the piece of paper with her. She would just tell them that she was going to Sir Lionel or someone if they caught her. But then that thought of Weese and what he would do cuts in. She thinks she rather likes having feet instead of running off. But then a squad of archers walks past, telling about the Starks and how monstrous and evil they are. They also take turns bragging and fretting about facing the Starks in battle. Arya thinks that they should all run away, and that includes Tywin, Sir Gregor, and everyone going out to face her brother in battle. "All of you better run, or my brother will kill you. He's a Stark. He's more wolf than man. And so am I." But then Weese is there. He grabs the sword from Arya and backhands her for being so slow to complete her errand. Arya becomes a mouse again for a moment, tasting blood from Weese's blow. She hates him now more than ever. Arya looks at Weese murderously, and Weese threatens her with another blow and then orders her to accomplish more errands. And she's going to have to double time it if she wants to eat tonight. Somehow, I know it's hard to believe, Weese has forgotten his promise to Arya of the capon. Wow, crazy. I was really looking forward to Arya eating that chicken, but no. God, Weese, you're so bad, so wrong. Weese threatens that if Arya gets lost again, he'll beat her bloody, but Arya knows better. She knows he'll never threaten her again, and Arya feels the old gods guiding her steps as she steps in Harrenhal. She passes under an archway and immediately runs into two heroes of A Song of Ice and Fire. No, wait, not heroes. It's Rorge and Biter, not heroes at all. They speak lots of really interesting words to Arya about whether Yorn kept her around because of her anatomy. Look, all I'm saying is that the characters on page if they can make me blush and flinch away, then they might be actually bad in real life. Anyways, now that Rorge and Biter are here, maybe they'll take sexual advantage of Arya, right? Not really. She wants to know where she can find Jaqen. Rorge halted. Something in his eyes. Could it be that he was scared of Jaqen H'ghar? The bathhouse. Get out of my way. So Arya heads to the bathhouse and finds Jaqen in the tub for a soak with a serving girl pouring hot water over his head. The narrative is kind of commuting here that the faceless men fuck. How about that? Arya tries creeping up on Jaqen, but he stops her and tells her that she's bigfooting her way on over to him. Surprised, Arya wonders how he knew that, but Jaqen says that the noise of leather on the floor is loud to someone like him. Again, someone who fucks. Anyway, why are you here, Arya? She has a message. And what's that message? Arya eyed the serving girl uncertainly. When she did not seem likely to go away, she leaned in until her mouth was almost touching Jaqen's ear. "Weese," she whispered. Jaqen H'ghar closed his eyes again, floating languid, half asleep. "Tell his lordship a man shall attend him at his leisure." His hand moved suddenly, splashing hot water at her, and Arya had to leap back to keep from getting drenched. Jaqen being playful, this guy is so fucking weird. Anyways, Arya heads down to the brewer to tell him what Weese told her to tell him. He gets cursed. He gets cursed for her trouble, but the brewer promises to deliver the barrels of ale so long as Weese provides the manpower to roll them out. Day in the life of Arya Weasel. But that night, Arya does get to eat. She gets a stew. Not great. A girl who Weese was sleeping with gets a piece of blue cheese and a wing from the capon that Weese had promised Arya. But Weese eats everything else besides a few bites on the thigh. Arya thinks that maybe Weese is saving them for her, but no. He orders her over, grabs her throat, and backhands her twice for apparently looking at him. Awesome. He then finishes off the last bites and tosses the bones to his dog. "Weese," Arya whispered that night. She bent over the tear in her shift. "Dunson, Polliver, Wrath the Sweetling," she said, calling a name every time she pushed the bone needle through the undyed wool. "The Tickler and the Hound, Sir Gregor, Sir Amory, Sir Ilyn, Sir Meryn, King Joffrey, Queen Cersei." She wondered how much longer she would have to include Wiese in her prayer, and drifted off to sleep, dreaming that on the morrow, when she woke, he'd be dead. Unfortunately, the next morning, it's Wiese who wakes her up with a kick. It was that day that Tywin Lannister himself was riding away from Harrenhal, and Wiese warns that the work and beatings will continue even with Tywin gone. Plus, it'll be twice as hard as there will be fewer hands to help out. Wiese will see to that. Sure thing, bud. Arya thinks before heading up to a tower to watch Tywin die. Leave. He dies eventually. From her tower window, Arya looks down on Tywin in his amazing finery of a horse, clothing, and armor. Fellow war criminal Kevin Lannister sidles up next to Tywin, also looking spectacular. 4 standard bearers advance ahead of the Lannister bros, and all the men of Tywin's host with the Red Ox, Golden Mountain, Purple Unicorn, Bantam Rooster. It's actually Harris Swift's famous blue cock sigil, guys. Love that sigil. Brindled Boar, Badger, Silver Ferret, and a juggler in motley stars and sunbursts. Peacock and Panther, Chevron and Dagger, Black Hood and Blue Beetle and Green Arrow sigils all stand behind Tywin. Last of all was Sir Gregor Clegane with his horned helmet wearing Poliver, this being the helmet that he stole from Gendry, right next to him. A shiver crept up Arya's spine as she watched them pass under the great iron portcullis of Harrenhal. Suddenly, she knew that she had made a terrible mistake. I'm so stupid, she thought. Wiese did not matter no more than Chiswick had. These were the men that mattered, the ones she ought to have killed. Last night, she could have whispered any of them dead. If only she hadn't been so mad at Wiese for hitting her and lying about the capon. Lord Tywin. Why didn't I say Lord Tywin? But maybe it's not too late. She needed to find Jaqen before Wiese died. So Arya runs down the stairs and through the courtyard of Harrenhal as the gate closes as Tywin's army runs off. And then she hears another sound, a scream filled with pain and fear. A dozen people got there before her, though none were coming any too close. Arya squirmed between them. Wiese was sprawled across the cobbles, his throat a red ruin, eyes gaping sightlessly at a bank of gray clouds. His ugly, spotted dog stood on his chest, lapping at the blood pulsing from his neck, and every so often ripping a mouthful of flesh. Someone takes a crossbow and kills the dog, lapping at the blood flowing from Wiese's throat. It was Wiese's dog who did the deed, and everyone mutters about Harrenhal being cursed and Harren's ghost killing Wiese. Good wife Amabel declares that she's not going to sleep here anymore. No, sir. Arya lifted her gaze from the dead man and his dead dog. Jaqen H'ghar was leaning up against the side of the Wailing Tower. When he saw her looking, he lifted a hand to his face and laid 2 fingers casually against his cheek. And that is a Clash of Kings Aria 8. Well, now that we're up to Arya's 8th chapter of Clash of Kings, I could almost forget that Arya's arc started at a slow, honestly somewhat boring pace. We're in this shit now, and I love it. What did you 2 think of this chapter? Evan, you're muted, man.
Oh, sorry, bud. Thought I hit the mute button. My fault. Arya 8 might not have a devastating showstopper sequence like Chiswick's story in Arya 7, but it more than makes up for it with its own unique strengths, particularly in how it showcases George's mastery of atmosphere. He can move on a dime between the chaotic tableau of an army in motion with which the chapter starts to a scene of quiet, mysterious intimacy like Arya and Jaqen in the bathhouse. All of it comes together as the context in which Arya makes her next big choice, her next interjection into the domain of death. While the choice to kill Wiese and not, say, Tywin, is rooted in her personal internal struggles conveyed so vividly and fiercely in this chapter, it takes place against the backdrop of the Age of Wonder and Terror, the political and magical expansions that naturally come together at Harrenhal, where Black Harren climbed the fiery ladder to find Aegon the Conqueror and his dreadful Black Shadow waiting for him. These twin forms of power, separated at birth, are careening out of control and laying waste to all we, mere mortals caught between them, hold dear. In the wake of righteously taking down Chiswick in her last chapter, Arya seizes onto Jaqen's seemingly limitless ability to kill at will as her way to control the brutal chaos all around her. But as the chapter ends, she feels as adrift and powerless as anyone else, lost in both a fairy tale maze and the Game of Thrones. What did you think of this chapter going back through it, McCall?
So one of the reasons I really like this chapter is because it's kind of a nothing chapter in the grand macro view of, A Song of Ice and Fire. Like, some important things could have happened. Arya could have used her wish in a politically effective way and off Tywin or the Mountain or someone like that, but that doesn't happen. She also could have escaped from Harrenhal pretty easily, actually. She doesn't do that. Tywin's departure is definitely the most important story significant part of this particular chapter, and Arya contributes to that maybe 0%. It's really, you know, the parts of this chapter that mean things to Arya, the death of Wiese, things like that, they don't mean anything in the greater story. And I don't even think that this chapter is thematically kind of on, you know, like so many of Arya's chapters in the early part of the book are about the suffering of the small folk that you guys have discussed like so well in previous episodes. But this pain is all kind of internal to the social structure. It's kind of socially ordained. It's, you know, it's not out of the ordinary. And everything that's painful belongs to Arya. This is the second wish, like you guys titled the chapter. It's, you know, in any fairy tale, the second wish is the boring wish. You know, like, you know, the first one is like, okay, yeah, all right, ooh, you get what you want. The second wish is like, yes, this is real, it's true. And then the third wish does the flippy that we're going to talk about later. You need it, but it's usually pretty forgettable of itself. And then the amazing thing about this chapter is that Arya realizes that when it's too late. She realizes that she squandered her second wish. And it's just when the jaws of the trap close and it's too late. You know, it's a petty chapter and the outcomes are tragic because they're petty. And I think it's easily overlooked, but really masterfully done.
I absolutely agree. I think it's interesting too, if you consider it being Arya's second wish, whether like she realizes like in kind of the subconscious way, like those stories, like I learned about this, like when I was growing up, like, you know, that the second wish, you're not supposed to waste your second wish on something mundane. And then finally when it snaps into place, it's too late. And then she kind of has to roll with it from there. Could be something that's going on. Again, Arya and Sansa are more alike than people give them credit for. We'll talk about that towards the end of this episode. So one of the things I was thinking about when I was thinking about this chapter is something we were discussing at the end of our little chill session we do at the end of every single live stream. And for this one, we were doing it for our prior Fever Dream episode live cast this past Thursday, when we were talking about how small acts of violence and horror sometimes shock us and kind of get under our skin when over-the-top depictions of violence don't. So here I was thinking and musing about why that moment in the chapter where Wiese grabs Arya's throat and backhands her twice, why that feels so much more visceral than Wiese's dog tearing off chunks of his face and drinking his blood. I mean, on one level, we understand because we care about Arya and feel that catharsis that such an overt villain got his at the end of the chapter. But on another level, I don't know how to put this like politely, but there's a feeling of intimacy about being choked and backhanded that gets me, at least. I mean, it resonates with some of my experiences growing up, and sadly, it probably does for a lot of our listeners too. George does a wonderful job of showing both sides of violence. But for me, George really hits home in depicting the sickening dread of a beating to come and the commonplace violence when it actually does come.
Very well put, brother. But before we get to any of the kind of more intimate parts of this chapter, we start with the big picture. Arya 8 opens on pure cacophony, a trumpet blast of images and sounds as thousands of people and all their stuff spring into action at once. It's very cinematic, a hard cut to a blast of noise to get the audience's attention, waking them up like the cockatoo that Orson Welles threw into Citizen Kane, just to wake up anyone up in the audience who was sleeping. George cuts in from the master shot to inserts of smiths, squires, seamstresses, but they all swirl together into a single crowded portrait of an army in motion. As George puts it, the true ruler of the castle is neither Tywin Lannister nor Black Heron's ghost. It is confusion and clangor that rule Harrenhal now. And this wonderfully expresses the mundane side of Harrenhal that contrasts with the spooky supernatural side, as we talked about in previous Arya chapters. No one really knows what they're doing in this chapter. Everyone is just confused and running around and yelling at each other. I mean, the tasks are being accomplished bit by bit, but the overall impression is one of a, quote, swelling tide of noise, crowding out thought. A perfect microcosm of how societies are always rising and falling at the same time. And it's all because, quote, Lord Tywin Lannister was marching at last. And why is he marching? Well, it's not to defend Joffrey from Stannis. It's because in his little cat and mouse lion and fawn game with Robb Stark, Tywin turned out to be the fawn all along.
I'm so glad that you used those animal terms, because this chapter relies so heavily and so beautifully on animal imagery. These are obviously important ideas. In Arya's story, Arya Horseface, she's called, she emotionally relies on the idea of being part of a pack. Eventually she, cheats on the Faceless Men by becoming a cat. But in this chapter, the animal imagery makes it helps explain why Arya makes the mistake she does. She's a character who can sometimes almost be a little bit too clever for the narrative sometimes. And in this chapter, she's literally driven by petty instinct. And in this chapter, more than other occasions, Arya is possessed of an animal motivation. She acts on hunger, on pain, and the possible relief of those things. I don't think she thinks that she's acting for those reasons, but she is. There's no real calculation. It's conditioning. It's reward and punishment. Arya ate, it's, in my opinion, the story of basically the animal food chain, a hungry creature who, she moves up the chain in power, but not in motivation. Which is sort of the opposite of what Tywin is doing, if you think about it, because he's trying to stop himself and his family from sinking down the food chain while refusing to acknowledge that is what is actually happening.
Exactly right. Tywin's kind of projection of himself is starting to look a little shaky. I mean, Tywin's plan up until now in A Clash of Kings to sap Robb's strength before luring him out to defeat so Tywin can focus on the Baratheon bros instead has totally fallen apart. Mm-hmm. Robb rode off in the other direction, subverting Lannister defenses at the Golden Tooth, killing Tywin's cousin, destroying the army that was supposed to help Tywin defeat Robb, running roughshod over the lands of Tywin's vassals, and even threatening Lannisport and the Rock itself, as far as Tywin knows, that is.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the Lannister low water mark in the war. You have enemies in every direction but the southeast and King's Landing. And even farther than King's Landing, you got Stannis there in Storm's End. Definitely coming very soon to King's Landing. He's going to get there real soon as he finishes business in Storm's End. It's going to be tomorrow, maybe the next day. Maybe next week. We talk a lot about George has done a lot of research on politics and history, religion, pop culture, movies, etc., to make his stories feel organic. But what this kind of reminds me of, and all this kind of confusion and clamor that's going on in Harrenhal, is board games. I mean, the pieces are moving, the board is getting reshuffled, and suddenly the faction that started the game off in the strongest position is suddenly very weak. Ukraine is weak. Classic board game shit. I mean, George R. Martin himself is famous for his love of board games and his licensed Song of Ice and Fire for several board games, as people know, or maybe don't know. They're okay games. They're not that good. He once commented, though, he said, I was a comic book fanboy, one of the original comic book fanboys. Thank you very much. The ones who started comics fandom. Yeah,
he's very proud.
I just can't imagine like writing this as like a human being, but whatever. And the comic
George was a nerd before it was cool, guys.
Yeah, right. And the comic book fanboy thinks that games and cards and miniatures and all that stuff is hot shit. And that comes from a Notablog entry from 2007. The important takeaway for all of you guys who are writers out there, which is many of you, is to take things that you love in your leisure time and make them part of your universe, kind of integrate them in, because it'll be something you'll be very familiar with. The important takeaway for the story, though, is that if this was the game of Risk, Tywin Lannister has lost Australia, and now he has enemies all around his last continent, which is Europe. He will be willing to sacrifice his kind of North African territories if he has to, even if most of his family's there. You'll know what I mean if you've ever played Risk before.
I don't play Risk. You guys are nerds.
I was about to say Risk. Risk is for normies, like Axis and Allies and above, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, my sister, I've tried to play board games, and then the shark-like look in her eye as she amasses all of the wheat on Catan. If I want to sleep.
That game can possess people's souls in a beautiful and terrifying way. They're not to be messed with.
It's
We can
quite
play that
fun.
online. Yeah, the Nauticast plays. Yeah,
No, thank you.
That'd be so much fun. Oh yeah, all the good stuff. I mean, basically, Tywin has to make a move now or lose it all. But it's not just geopolitics that's motivating Tywin on the march out from Harrenhal, right? There's something more at work with what Tywin is doing.
Well, there's also his reputation, which lies at the core of his political approach. All of this has the cumulative effect of making Tywin look like a fool, threatening the reputation of competence and danger Tywin cares about more than anything, because that's the foundation of the power he wants to hand on to his grandkids. And once again, as at King's Landing in Sansa 3 and Winterfell in Bran 5, we are seeing the Battle of Oxcross as a shadow on a wall. We see it not directly through the eyes of those who fought, but indirectly through the eyes of the political communities that transform its meaning with their fears and desires. For Sansa, Oxcross is a glorious victory that nonetheless compounds her suffering in the moment. For Bran, Oxcross is nice and all, but it doesn't win the war, which would bring Robb home, which is all he and Rickon really care about. Specifically, Bran doesn't take much heart from Oxcross because it wasn't Tywin who was defeated there. But now Tywin himself is rejoining the fray personally, because for him, Oxcross means he must march west or risk losing his army. I say risk, not like guarantee, because Tywin's personal history, reputation, and relationships with these lords generally serve to keep them in line, even in dangerous situations. But as I said, that reputation has now taken some serious hits from the very man they are marching to fight, who is occupying more of their home territory every day. Tywin's personal shadow on a wall is starting to fade. His power exists because his men believe power resides with him. What happens if they stop believing that? The tides are starting to turn, not only among his lords, but the common men who are saying things like, "Giants, I tell you, he's got giants 20 foot tall, come down from beyond the wall, follow him like dogs. And not natural to coming on them so fast in the night and all, he's more wolf than man, all them Starks are." Here we see the power of rumor and propaganda to shape reputation, and in turn, the power of reputation to shape reality, even when it's built on lies. The irony is that while the wild exaggeration of Robb's sorcery was used by Lancel in Sansa 3 to excuse the Lannisters for their incompetence and defeat, that same rumor mill works against Lannister morale here by making Robb so scary. Yet Tywin must still march west in order to show his lords he will defend their lands from Robb Stark. If he doesn't, if he sticks around at Harrenhal in order to stay close enough to King's Landing to defend it when Stannis marches, it is entirely possible that some or even most of his lords will desert him for their own lands. It's the same reason Renly had to ride for Storm's End when Stannis threatened it. It's the same reason Robb has to try and get home when the Ironborn invade. If you can't defend home and hearth, you are nothing. Fear of Tywin can still keep this army together in the face of that crisis, but not for long if he stays here.
I mean, you said it really well. I mean, when Tywin, Renly, and eventually Stannis too, when they all die, their causes die with them. Something we explored, exhibiting like we were doing those Catelyn episodes last month. Their armies melt away, and the lords find someone else to serve, someone who's, they can reward them better. Yeah, I mean, the Westermen aren't precisely going to just desert en masse after Tywin's death in a storm of swords, but they kind of fade. They fade from the narrative. Jaime from A Feast for Crows talks about how 2,000 seasoned veterans was all that remained of the army that was left from Tywin's, and most of them end up dying at the battle of Dragonstone in A Feast for Crows. I mean, remember that Tywin's host at Harrenhal is something like 12,000 to maybe 18,000. It's kind of upper tier level that we hear. 2,000 go to Dragonstone. Some other dudes end up joining the Gold Cloaks. So we have Davin Lannister with some of Tywin's army out in the Westerlands, and about maybe 900 or so with Jaime that go to River Run, and 200 escort Tywin's body back to the Westerlands after his funeral. That leaves about 3/4 of the army that's completely unaccounted for, and I don't think that casualties from the War of the Five Kings explains where they all went. I think that the fear that was Tywin Lannister himself, the person, the Lord, was removed, and most of them went home unconcerned they'd face any real consequences. They're right. Recall, too, that during that mad rush to reach the Ruby Ford back into Game of Thrones, Tywin ends up abandoning all of the wounded Lannister soldiers on the side of the road just to die, because he was attempting to save Jaime as quickly as he could. Ends up not working out. Because I'm reading Dune, as you guys might know now, I'm a little bit over halfway through. I was reading a chapter before we started recording this episode. I reached a part where Gurney Halleck is talking about the Atreides military slogan. He says, "We care for our own," which is a really kind of inspiring thing. It's like, leave no man behind. That ain't the Lannister way, though. Who generally wants to take up arms on behalf of a cause that's willing to let you die if you're a fucking inconvenience to them? Not me. I won't want to join that army. And that says nothing about the type of war that the Lannisters are conducting during the War of the Five Kings and thereafter. It really, I think, sucks to the soul. And I want to say that's the most important reason why the army just kind of melts away. Guilt, shame over their conduct during the War of the Five Kings.
Yeah, I think when it all boils down, certainly at this point, everyone involved in the Lannister war effort is kind of trying to convince themselves that they're at the top of the food chain. That is kind of what I feel very much in Tyrion's chapters. And Tywin has that really bad habit of binding his own perceived worth to the standing of his house. And that means that when he thinks he might not be at the top of the heap, that's the equivalent of being Arya. Bullied, powerless, at the whim of others, certainly being laughed at, and that's completely unacceptable. So, we see over and over again throughout the story that power becomes its own justification. It doesn't matter if it's real or not, it's the shadow on the wall, But as long as Tywin acts like it's real and subsequently, cleanses his actions with that power, see, Rainy, the Aegon and Rhaenys, that it's all good. And I actually kind of wonder if that's what the Lannister force is. I mean, it's hard to necessarily blame like the rank and file soldiers, but like I think they might be relying on the quote unquote natural strength of Tywin Lannister, and obviously that's going to collapse like an overused metaphor later on, thankfully. But at the moment, we're all safe in Harrenhal, we're grand and golden, and this unnatural, weird northern army or a red god won't stand a chance against us, against Lord Tywin Lannister. I actually think it's worth looking for a second at the overblown way that the Lannister men refer to Robb. Their fear does make him more powerful, as you noted, Emmett, but also less human. So his victories have challenged all of their perceptions of the typical order of destruction. The lion's supposed to eat the wolf. And so they have to put him outside of that order and recontextualize him into something supernatural in order to be able to understand what's going on. And obviously the language that they end up using for that is bestial. There are giants who follow Robb like dogs. Robb himself is more wolf than man, and so are all the Starks. And while, the language being used to describe and understand Robb by his enemies doesn't, materially influence his own power, I don't think he gives a shit. But this kind of language does very much influence Arya.
Absolutely, it does. The camera pans down from all the chaos at the adult level to find Arya underfoot, dashing around on the ground, running errands and soaking it all in. Her tiny child muscles render her unfit for most of the tasks involved here, so Wiese has her running messages. Information, lighter than air, but still powerful. Arya's underfoot status, her role as the mouse scurrying around the huge halls of Harrenhal, determines her access to that information, for better and worse. On one hand, all she hears about Oxcross is bits and pieces, scraps of half-heard gossip bandied about by adults who themselves don't know the truth. This is a pointed contrast to the full breakdown of the battle received by our POVs in King's Landing and Winterfell, who are close enough to the heart of power to learn all the details about what went down in the Westerlands. In Sansa 3, we saw the crafting of propaganda at the very top with Lancel's story about Robb's sorcery. Here in Arya 8, we see how that trickles down the social pyramid until it becomes competing strands of wild gossip among the small folk. The lords get the facts, the peasants get the rumors. At Arya's level, Oxcross feels more like Renly's death, which actually did involve sorcery, and so is shrouded by mystery for those at the top as much as those at the bottom. When the High Lords play their Game of Thrones, the masses only get incomplete fragments of what's happening in their country and must puzzle out the rest. And that's a real-world, modern-day phenomenon, despite how much our media has changed. What does Epstein's death mean? We'll never know, but we can argue about it and guess infinitely.
Yeah, the narration, concludes at the end of all this that something had happened. That much was certain. And I was just like, oh my God, I feel this daily. Just like, I don't know exactly what, I don't know exactly who, but I know that something. And that's kind of like what you end up relying on as a decision marker. Has something changed or something not changed?
That's a great point.
It's fun.
Yeah, it can be fun. Not these days. It used to be fun. Like something has happened. Ooh, what is that something? I'm so surprised. But these days, like, oh, what has actually happened now? What shit has befallen us these days? So I was thinking a little bit more about these kind of like rumors and things that we were talking about, which I just love in A Song of Ice and Fire. Eventually, I've had it in mind for years to kind of write an essay about it, but it's just never materialized on actual piece of paper. I like kind of the fun way that George integrates this idea in the narrative that rumors that the small folk pass between each other, that they conveys truths that the High Lords are unaware of. And we know this from Davos' second chapter in Dance of Dragons, where he's the lazy eel in White Harbor, and he's overhearing the small folk telling actual facts information that not even Varys seemingly knows about. And what I love best, and you referenced this before, Emma, but I'll bring it up again when you reference it as well, McCall. But this idea about this gossip she overhears from the Lannister men. I mean, they're sort of wrong. Robb hasn't actually brought giants down. He's not more wolf than man, but they're also kind of right too. Robb has brought the Umbers down from the north. They're basically giants, right? They're like 7 feet tall. I mean, you're about 4 feet or so short of a giant, but still, these are giants. They have giants as their sigils, so you can see like how that information gets broken down at a lower level. and more wolf than man. Again, we're alluding to Robb being the warg, Robb having a bond with Grey Wind and being able to utilize him during the Battle of Oxcross. There was no actual sorcery involved in Oxcross the same way that Renly's death kind of drew itself out into, but we do see that Robb used his magical bond with his wolf to win that battle. So there was a little bit of magic in there, just not, a fucking shadow demon coming and stabbing Renly through the neck. Just, a little bit of a lower type of magic, I would say.
All the most effective lies carry with them a nugget of truth. You got to sprinkle a little gold dust in among the bullshit, both as a politician and as a storyteller. And so, yeah, as McCall said, all Arya knows, all the people around her know, is something has happened. And whatever that something is, it's uprooted their whole world. They get no say in any of it, and they have to keep following orders, working themselves to the bone. On the other hand, Arya's underfoot status guarantees that she goes overlooked and undervalued by the adults around her, which is an advantage in its own way. Remember what Dantos tells Sansa later on in this book. I hear all sorts of things as a fool that I never heard when I was a knight. They talk as though I am not there. By that same token, Weese never imagines that Arya can read, something that separates her from the people around her, hinting at her true identity. As such, Weese doesn't seal the messages he sends around, allowing Arya access to the information contained within. Now, most of it is useless to her, a recurring theme in George's work where the quest for knowledge is the point rather than the knowledge itself. This came up in our most recent episode on Fever Dream with Abner searching Joshua's cabin, not really finding anything useful, but the fact that he made that decision to go in is kind of the overall point of that scene. Arya doesn't learn some wild, important revelation like, say, R + L = J from her ability to read these messages. All she learns is that one knight has a gambling debt, which he doesn't know, because he can't read. In the topsy-turvy world of Harrenhal, the knights can't read, and the quote-unquote peasant girl carrying their messages can. When she tells the knight about his debt, he tries to shoot the messenger, reaching out to hit Arya. The ability to read has hindered her in this situation. Her true identity as someone who can read could potentially lead to pain. But instead, Arya steals a drinking horn, relying on her thief gutter rat skill she's picked up since she was Arya Stark, and she gives it to Weese, proving her worth to him. He is pleased and makes a very significant promise, like the bond she made with Jaqen, a promise to share his dinner with her that night.
And I especially on this reread, it stuck out to me that promise is part of Arya's conditioning, and it works. You can almost feel the weight in this chapter of Arya's terror of Weese. He's the top of her personal food chain. She doesn't run away out of terror of his retribution. Arya is literally contracting basically a magical assassin, and she imbues Weese with the powers to read her mind and to hurt her and control her. In this chapter, Arya, she calls herself a mouse and she calls herself a wolf, and she is called Weasel by everyone else, but I kind of see her as one of Weese's dogs. And like Weese's dog, she turns out to have a set of teeth that he does not see coming.
As will Ramsay's dogs, perhaps, no doubt.
Please.
Here's hoping.
So for the moment, it appears that Arya's ability to read, something kept intact from her old life, is helping her survive. It's going to get her extra food. But Weese won't keep his promise. More on that later. Throughout Arya's busy day, George keeps reminding both her and us what she's missing while shut up in Harrenhal, the home and family to which Yoren was trying to return her, where she learned how to read. Will she ever get them back? How? In Arya 7, the temptation to escape and make it back home was represented by Lord Cerwyn, a Northman known to Arya Stark of Winterfell. But then he died, death being always the brick wall Arya runs up against. In Arya 8, the temptation has evolved to escaping on her own, because she got radicalized by Chiswick's story and is more reluctant to count on adults to save her. Weese's messages often take her outside the castle. She's tempted to just jump on a wagon and escape, counting on anonymity and chaos to make her invisible. But the threat of Weese holds her back. Specifically, he threatens any runaway with punishment by the Bloody Mummers. Here we see how the power structures of Westeros at war work on the bottom. The peasants, enslaved for their labor, are kept in line by the threat of violence committed by the Lord's disavowable assets. It's just layers of non-people. The Bloody Mummers are disavowable, and they'll commit war crimes on the peasants we don't acknowledge, and the Lords just have to acknowledge none of this. Even the idea of home seems dangerous to Arya, because Weese acts like he can read your thoughts. And Gendry also tells her that the idea of home is dangerous when he goes and talks to her. He pulls her aside to tell her that Hotby heard her yelling Winterfell at the battle by the God's Eye.
Okay, I have to interrupt you for just 1 second, because I have to point out what I personally think is probably the greatest single moment of adaptation on all of Game of Thrones. The scene in season 2, episode 5, when Gendry is at his forge and he is bare-chested and he is very sweaty and covered in soot, and Arya is just like glancing at him from under her hair. Like, I enjoy this. I'm not sure why yet though. And
that is exactly no idea. Just totally blank. Like why?
Yeah. Perfect. Perfect A+. Peak viewing TV.
What's your deadlift routine, Joe Dempsey? That's what I want to know. I want to get that skinny strong like fitness level that Joe Dempsey has from that scene. Oh, it's so good. Anyways, let's get back to the analysis of this chapter.
The most unorthodox. Bluster. And so Gendry pulling Arya aside to say, hey, Hot Pie heard you yelling Winterfell at the battle. This may seem like a curious, irrelevant detail for George to include. It's not like anything ever comes of this. So why mention it at all? Well, because it ties so perfectly into this chapter's focus on how to preserve one's identity in a chaotic, violent situation. Arya spends this whole book pretending to be someone else. For one moment, in the middle of battle, in the middle of hell, she stopped pretending and fought on behalf of her real self, family, and home, Winterfell. And what was the outcome? Suspicion and alienation, a worry that people might find out who you really are and you'll suffer for it. This is George doing his best kind of subtle deconstruction. The battle cry in fantasy is supposed to be the ultimate expression of self in the face of death, a thrilling moment for the audience. Gondor, our heroes cry as they charge into battle, and we cry it out with them. But crying out Winterfell was a mistake for Arya. If it threatens her now, what if we should find out who she is? She'd never be able to escape then. So it's this beautiful contradiction wherein Arya must negate and suppress her Stark identity in order to preserve the hope of escaping Harrenhal to resume that Stark identity back on the outside. And so Arya begins to think about killing Wiese, but specifically with the goal of escaping at first. That's not going to be her ultimate motivation for killing him. And George is very focused on that transition and how it plays out because it's thematically important. Arya also briefly considers killing Hot Pie to cover up his, possible knowledge of who she is, which is hilarious that Arya's just thinking, maybe Hot Pie is the true danger here. But it's also representative of where Arya's head is. Threats are emerging from every corner. In Harrenhal, everything is zero-sum, and no relationships can be counted on for long. Far from empowering her, this ability to kill at will is making her more paranoid, more overwhelmed, feeling less in control.
Yeah, I kind of find that the irony is a little gross and awful that Arya finds herself in this, suspicion, dog-eat-dog mentality, kind of less than when she's on the road. All of the, basically lambs for the slaughter with Gregor are basically treated the same in that they're not treated as human. And then, but here, in human society, in Harrenhal, we're all people, we're all working for the Lord, we all have our position. That's when she becomes part of the hierarchy, and that's kind of when that darkness kind of creeps in, to her life. She doesn't think about killing Hot Pie herself when he finds out she's a girl, Yeah,
so those are great points, and I think too. I mean, what we're seeing is this element in Harrenhal, which transform you. Like on the road, they were sheep to be shorn, as she talks about in Arya 6. She becomes a mouse in Arya 7, and has something of a wolfish identity at the end of the chapter when she sicks Jaqen H'ghar on Chiswick. But I think what we're seeing also here too is this aspect that Harrenhal is untrustworthy. It goes back to the Stones betraying Harren the Black, and historically, so to speak, where he thought that they would save him, but they didn't end up saving him. And that kind of filters all the way down from that huge top level layer on down to the lowest part of the castle. And that takes us to Wiese and what he does with Arya and her second wish.
Arya pays for this one moment when she allows herself to be Arya instead of Weasel, because Harrenhal is the domain of petty tyrants who bootstrap that kind of individual humanity. Arya stops dead, stares into space. She imagines running off with a horse and a sword. She could use the power of text and literacy we were talking about earlier in her favor, knowing that the stable boys can't read the paper. She hears the soldiers talk about Robb, and she glories in imagining his victory. They are wolves, strong and fierce. If they run together, no one can hurt them. But then Wiese shatters her daydream and drags her back to the harsh realities of Harrenhal. His voice described as cracking like a whip, which is a significant comparison. He takes the sword away and slaps her. The promise of extra food, so significant for Arya given how many calories she has been denied, falls away in an instant. This is life under occupation. You have no rights, no dignity, no security, no personhood. Your basic needs of survival, let alone anything else, depend on the whims of the cruel. The wolf is gone. The pack is gone. The connection provided to her old life by hearing about Robb's victory and fearsome reputation, the ability to cry out Winterfell in the midst of all this chaos, Weese took it all away.
And it's so awful that like Weese can take it away from her. Like she does feel that he has done that. She imbues him with that power because she's been sublimated into his, sad little kingdom where she's a creature who is satisfied or not, or in pain or not, at Weese's whim. And, I just keep thinking like Tywin doesn't know who Weese is. Like no. The important people don't give a shit about this. It's just all taking place, it's worse than like, upstairs, downstairs. It's just like important, non-existent.
Exactly right. And structurally, this moment is the equivalent of Chiswick's story in Arya 7. I say structurally because it motivates the decision to kill, not because they're anything close to the same thing in terms of impact or sheer Baroque sadism. In isolation, a slap and a lost meal are not on the same order as rape or murder. But as I said in our Arya 7 episode, none of this is happening in isolation. Just as in Arya 7, George does such careful, effective work on a sentence-by-sentence basis to establish Arya's mindset and motives in this moment. First of all, this is happening to her, rather than a story being told around her. There are personal qualities at play, not only physical pain, but shock, embarrassment, self-loathing, powerlessness. Everyone pain invites to the party. Secondly, Weese was already a fearsome figure in her life, threatening her constantly, hemming in her escape. She was already considering killing him. But thirdly, Weese just seemed to have softened a bit, giving her a reward, allowing her to think that maybe she has some control over her life. Maybe she isn't completely alienated from her labor. Maybe she's more than a mouse, a slave, a leaf caught up on the winds of winter. Maybe there's still a way for her to relate to her environment other than her kill list brought to life by Jaqen. And then Weese slams that door shut, unknowingly sealing his own doom, not only by being cruel, but by taking back his brief kindness, the exception to the cruelty. Arya cannot handle that. It hurts too much, inside as well as out, especially because Weese made clear to her, without even realizing it, that she might not ever get home to her family that she was daydreaming about.
That's really well said. I completely agree. And you were talking before about how the class structures work to violently oppress the peasants in Harrenhal, with the nobility being that cudgel, and I emphatically agree with that point. To add something onto that, something that I was thinking about as I was thinking about this chapter, is that what I see with Weese and the Good Wives in this chapter and the follow-on Aria 9 and Aria 10 is how they attempt to replicate the class structure against their fellow small folk. Again, something you were alluding to, McCall. This is far from a benign class structure, if such a thing can exist. I'm not a Marxist, so I can't actually say that with certainty. What Weese does in his conduct with Arya in this chapter, and as well in the previous Arya chapter, is recreate the horrors of the march north to Harrenhal, just at a simpler level that's almost more insidious. We have all the same archetypes here. We have peasants brutalized for annoying the mountain's men. We have that boy who gets his leg bitten off or gets his calf chewed off by Weese's dog for annoying Weese. We have women who attempt to survive the horror by sleeping with their oppressors. We've got that one woman who is sleeping with one of Gregor's men on the march down, on the march up, and we have the one woman who is sleeping with Weese here in this chapter. And then there's Arya's fear that Weese can read her secret thoughts, which functions similarly to the Tickler's questions in his attempts to find out all of the secrets of the small folks. Where are your gems? Is there gold hidden in the village? Where is Beric Dondarrion? Where? And then remember Gregor Clegane telling Arya and the small folk that they weren't allowed to even look at the highborn in the eye. Weese in this chapter grabs Arya's throat towards the end of this chapter. We'll talk about this in a little bit, and backhands her twice for daring to look him in the eye. And finally, and I think most significantly, is that we have this idea of Arya considering herself to be a sheep shorn, and that's what Gregor Clegane is doing with these small folk marching on up to Harrenhal. And here, Arya's identity, as we've been kind of covering over and over again, is being ripped finally from her. She thinks she's a wolf at one point, and then suddenly Weese just takes her and just rips that identity back from her, takes her own autonomy and her ability to be someone, to be someone in this place that just swallows you up and forces her back down to being that mouse. It's really, I mean, I'm not saying it's a 1-for-1 parallel what is happening here, but I certainly do understand why Arya ends up going to Jaqen and sicking him on Wiese in this chapter, because it feels really potent for her, given her what she has experienced on the road up to Harrenhal and what she's experiencing in this castle itself.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points and comparisons that I didn't think of. But again, I just keep thinking it's so petty. Like this whole scene is so emotionally significant to Arya, but it's nothing. It doesn't matter. Her master was cruel and the pet didn't get the treat it was promised. You know, it's a few bites of meat. I guarantee you that Catelyn has put more meat than that on Arya's plate in Winterfell, and she has not eaten it. But, you know, Emma, like you were saying, this is all in context. It doesn't take place in a vacuum. Arya has been acculturated to this system, and she's retaining just enough unexpected agency and power to push back completely unexpectedly. But in terms of the sheep thing also, like I think the shift that she wears that Wiese makes her fix is described as undyed wool. And like, that's, you know, the fact that he makes her like make that worth wearing again is, yeah. Interesting, George. Interesting.
Very well said, both of you. And yeah, it's not that Wiese is actually the source of Arya's woes. It's that all of this is compounding together to make Wiese the avatar of Arya's woes, as Renly became the stand-in for everything Robert did to Stannis. Like Stannis, Arya responds by whispering her target's name in a sorceress killer's ear. George emphasizes the weight of this decision by briefly reintroducing Rorge, who makes Wiese look positively humane by comparison. Unlike Jaqen, Rorge does not believe he owes Arya anything for saving his life. Quite the opposite. Rorge intends to rape her now that he knows she's a girl. What an abyss of humanity that is, to look at your savior and decide to brutalize her. It does not get any worse than Rorge. And he is terrified of Jaqen H'ghar. What does that say about Jaqen? Not that he's worse than Rorge, that's clearly not the case. It says that he belongs to a different category altogether. Jaqen is frightening not because he's a uniquely monstrous person, but because he's barely a person at all. Will Arya, in her pursuit of vengeance, become like him?
I do think that Jaqen's separateness is really appealing to Arya. I don't think she knows that yet, but I do think that there's something about that attracts her. He exists completely outside the words that I'm going to keep using, the food chain of Harrenhal and Westeros in general. He's, you know, that of itself makes him miraculous. You know, even if he weren't promising and delivering literal bloody miracles to Arya. But, you know, of course, her refusal to like unhook her heart from her family to stay connected is such a huge point in her story, even if she like literally disconnects from Westeros and goes to Braavos and adopts so many of the faceless man's way of life. You know, there's a lot to be speculated about Arya's future, but I think that this is definitely one of those like some of those battles, you know, that she'll be experiencing, the allure of being completely aloof and floating, you know, like Jaqen is in the water here. And the power that gives you versus the joy and the worthwhileness that your family does.
Exactly right. Aloof and floating. And I think this state in the bathhouse is kind of the state Arya is trying to achieve with the faceless men in the House of Black and White. This is how she kind of wants to feel. This is what they're offering her. Arya steps inside the bathhouse to find Jaqen, a scene that stands out from the rest of the chapter, like Jaqen visually stands out from his environment. Everyone else in Harrenhal is running around, getting all their possessions together, covered in dust and sweat and scowls. Jaqen soaks in water and steam, taking it easy. This bathhouse, of course, is where Jaime gets literally and metaphorically naked in a storm of swords, floating, quote, in heat and memory until he unburdens himself to Brienne. But when you peel back the layers of Jaqen's onion, there's nothing there. He's no one. So this bathhouse scene feels like it hovers outside of time and space. Rather than bearing the burden of backstory, it's an abstract space to test Arya. At a literal level, it really makes no sense that a simple soldier is being allowed to take it easy while the rest of the castle prepares for the long march. It fits the aura of magic and mystery that surrounds Jaqen. Maybe he's hypnotized this poor woman.
What does he even say? He's like, oh, obviously she doesn't give him orders, but he's like, tell my lord I will attend him at my leisure or something. And
right,
it's like,
a purposefully ambiguous,
you?
meaningless statement. Yeah. Exactly. just frustrating your ability to solve him further. While the rest of the castle and the rest of the army is in service to the Game of Thrones, the political side of the series, Jaqen and his little pocket universe here represent the magic, the age of wonder and terror. Arya has crossed the threshold, figuratively as well as literally. In all this smoke and water, in this kind of in-between state, Jaqen could be anyone. She could be anyone. And anyone could die. But she picks Wiese. The shadow on a wall takes shape, the bridge between the worlds is born and baptized in blood, and she flees back to the old world, changed.
That's really well said. I mean, we've talked about how Wiese is not nearly as bad as Chiswick, but he has that kind of ruder strain of evil, as we talked about, like common evil and a willingness to inflict violence on defenseless innocents. It's fascinating that I think Arya's intersection with Jaqen as a magical killer comes at the behest of this magical idea of vengeance, right? There's this famous quote from the Bible, from the author of Deuteronomy, which says, "Vengeance is mine and recompense, says the Lord. Their foot shall slip in due time, for the day of their calamity is at hand." That idea of vengeance as something cosmic and tied up in the supernatural is something that we see in the very curse of a place called Harrenhal. This castle is full of the supernatural, and we did talk about this in a prior episode about the curse of Harrenhal itself. But Arya here, she's taking vengeance in her own hands, tapping into the supernatural element present in Harrenhal, namely Jaqen H'ghar. It feels satisfying, right? You have to admit it does feel satisfying in the moment to strike back against another bad dude, another oppressor, another Chiswick. But again, Wiese isn't Chiswick, and that initial satisfaction in getting vengeance and utilizing the supernatural will fade almost immediately in this chapter.
Arya comes to regret her decision to order Wiese killed, and this regret is the emotional and philosophical heart of the chapter. And this is key to the fairy tale three-wish structure that George is employing in Harrenhal that McCall was talking about earlier. The first wish is morally uncomplicated, generally. It's a fireworks show used to legitimize the genie's power. Not only was Chiswick personally vile, he was raising other young men to behave like him. He had to go. George changes things up with a second wish in order to force both Arya and the audience to wonder how best to wield the power of violence in this unjust world. And I love how George paces Arya's change of mind. First, he dangles the possibility of Wiese's better angels re-emerging. He calls Arya over at dinner, and she thinks he's remembered his promise of extra meat. She regrets her order to kill. But then Wiese slaps her again, once more dangling the possibility of a better life before snatching it away.
Yeah, and I'm just going to pull out my English writing major lens here and do a little close reading because I think it's worth focusing on the way George presents this. Arya's eating, quote, a thin stew of barley, onion, and carrots with a wedge of stale brown bread, which, no offense, is a meal that you could maybe find in a lot of vegetarian restaurants, depending on maybe even vegan, depending on what's in the bread. But it's, Wiese and the woman that he favors who get animal protein, who get the blue cheese and the capon. It's a literal gustatory hierarchy. You are as important as what you are given to eat. And then to compound this, after Wiese, slaps Arya, he threatens to spoon out one of her eyes and feed it to his dog. I don't know if Wiese would ever do that, really, probably, but he then, immediately after he does that, he shoves Arya and he tosses the chicken bone to that dog, who is now officially higher up on the food chain than Weasel, because not only does the dog get to eat what she was going to eat, but he's like, I would feed you to the dog. You could literally be its food. And that makes it so deeply personal. And I think that's what makes the regret that she feels when she has that horrific zoom out moment that we're going to talk about in a minute stand out so strongly.
It's that great dehumanization of, you want more food? No, you are food. And that's what Arya feels in this moment. And this is the author making sure we understand that Arya's regret is not about Wiese himself. It's not about the question of whether or not he deserves it, because he is not interested in his own redemption. Arya's regret is driven by a growth in political consciousness, a maturation in her understanding of who is responsible for the suffering she has seen and felt. She wants Wiese dead because he made her feel like an ant, not a person, and I get that. But Wiese is an ant next to Gregor, who was an aunt next to Tywin.
Mm-hmm.
While Wiese's actions matter very much to Arya as an individual, Arya is not just an individual. She is a person who cares about what has happened and is still happening to other people. In that framework, Wiese matters far less than Gregor, because Gregor inflicts himself on hundreds and thousands, not dozens. And even Gregor matters less than Tywin, as Bran and Big Walder know, because Tywin commands them all. And this, again, has real-world implications. Part of growing up is realizing the links between the suffering in your own life and the injustice of the world at large. This is not to say you should ever ignore your own suffering, but that it is impossible to even conceptualize justice without putting individual suffering in some kind of larger context. Arya clarifies this complex idea in direct, childish terms. Tywin and Gregor matter. They matter in a way that Wiese does not. They matter in context. They matter in the big picture. They matter in terms of why any of this is being allowed to happen. Arya doesn't just want the catharsis of a man who hurt her getting his. She wants things to get better. She wants a change in how power works in Westeros. Killing Wiese is not going to make that happen. And so she feels all at once that she has wasted a wish, her most sacred resource, her one power in a world at war. She runs off to stop Jaqen, but it's too late. Turned Wiese's dog against him. Eventually, someone goes ahead and kills the dog. It's wretched and awful. It's also terrifying, because before we know about the basilisk blood from A Dance with Dragons, it looks like Jaqen has bewitched the dog into attacking its owner. Magic has intervened in the political hierarchies of Harrenhal, reshaping the world, just like it did at Storm's End. But it wasn't a king who died this time. It was someone on a far lower rung of the ladder, and Arya realizes too late she should have been aiming higher if she wanted to change the world. Personal fears and desires always animate political and magical power. So Tywin, unlike Renly, gets to ride away, golden lions shining, while Wiese bleeds out in the dirt behind him. Nothing is quite as simple as it seemed in Arya 7, and that's the story in microcosm. That which you think will fix everything won't. And the stories failed to warn you. I tried to grasp a star, overreached, and fell.
And I think in Arya's case here, she hasn't just fallen, she's fallen back. The language that George uses is distinctly trapped-like. After, all the knights and the lords and the golden lion and Gregor Clegane in his horned helm, because we're doing a lot of beast imagery, even though we would be anyway because of heraldry and George being a nerd. Arya hears the rattle of chains as the portcullis was slowly lowered, its spikes sinking deep into the ground. And Arya's choice here means that exactly, almost to the exact moment that the jaws close around Wiese, Arya is equally as trapped and almost basically devoured by Harrenhal.
Well said, both of you guys. I think those are both really well thought out points and really well said. I think there's an aspect too where Arya's lost her chance to escape in this moment. She had all of the chaos of the camp that's kind of thrown itself around, but now we're getting we're getting an almost parallel to what happened in Bran's 6th chapter in A Game of Thrones, where Robb and his army march off, and you only are left with the silence of what's left behind in Harrenhal. Harrenhal, as after this chapter, becomes kind of a quieter place for the space of about 2/3 of a chapter until Jaqen H'ghar wrecks fucking shit in this castle. But it's weird to me that, not weird to me, it's interesting to me that Arya here is returning back to Harrenhal. She has had the jaws of the castle close against her as in kind of that auditory sense, as you were pointing out, so McCall. And now she is left with this castle and left with a dead Wiese. So whence goes Arya from this point? Well, we know because it's a reread podcast, but I think it does speak to this possibility that Arya could have been swallowed up here. She could have been captured up in all of the chaos that ensues the fall of Harrenhal twice, right? Because it falls first to Roose Bolton, and then it falls again back to Vargo Hoat, and then it falls again after that back to the Mountains Men. And she could have been rolled up into all of that chaos there. Eventually, she does get out of this castle itself, but you can almost be forgiven for thinking at the end of this chapter that she is just about to fall and just about to be caught up in all the chaos that is coming to this haunted castle of Harrenhal.
Listen, having a third wish is handy.
True that, yeah. It's like wishing for more wishes, as we're going to find on Arya 9.
Speaking of which, moving on into foreshadowing and groundwork, talking about Arya 9, Vargo Hoat's hatred for Amory Lorch pays off big time in Arya's next chapter, when Vargo turns cloak to Roose Bolton and helps him take Harrenhal, leading to Amory's death by bear. So there's little mentions of how little these two like each other. That's going to pay off in the worst possible way for Amory Lorch.
Oh, it's really fun in a certain sense, but it's also like kind of like disturbing that Tywin put almost all of his disavowable assets in one location. Like it took all the people actually. He took all the people he actually gave a shit about and like rolled out of Harrenhal to go fight Robb Stark in the West. And we're going to leave Amory Lorch and Vargo Hoat at Harrenhal. Again, leaving the people in the Riverlands that he could basically be like, these were the ones who were actually doing all the terrible things that was going on. So in the event that Tywin loses the war, which is a very real possibility at the end of this chapter, then he could say like, look, if I survive, it's not me who did all the bad stuff. It was Vargo Hoat. It was Amory Lorch. And again, that's something that we are going to see in A Storm of Swords as Tywin attempts to basically say that Amory Lorch is solely responsible for what happened to Elia and Rhaenys and young Aegon.
Tywin is the master of the Shell Corporation, if you think about it.
Absolutely. Disavowable, always keep your hands clean. That's how power functions, and George manages to show us differently. Yeah. And another little bit of groundwork here. Just as Wiese threatens his charges with mutilation by Vargo if they disobey him, Arya will invent a threat from Vargo to get Gendry on her side in her next chapter. So she's learning how to play with these shadows on a wall. The idea of fear is something that she can take part in as well as just being victimized by.
And, as much as she invents the threat of what Vargo Hoat will do, she's not totally wrong, right? What happens in Harrenhal is fucking horrifying. I mean, you have women being raped repeatedly. You've got the same usual executions and terrible things occurring to all of the small folk who, again, didn't do anything wrong. They just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. And that's really just kind of terrifying. Again, we're kind of getting to that kind of baser level of evil, what happens when Roose Bolton takes over. And the new owners, just about the same as the old owners of Harrenhal itself. To talk a little bit more about this cutting off the limbs, we have Vargo Hoat being referenced as cutting the limbs off of people who run away, and that gets a plot repeat beat with the Tatter Prince and the Windblown in A Dance with Dragons when Quentin Martell hears that deserters from the Windblown who are caught get their feet cut off to prevent them from fleeing again. So something I was wondering about a little bit about, and I do think that maybe George went back to these Harrenhal chapters and kind of got a sense of what the sellsword companies were like that were coming from Essos. Is this something that sellsword companies are just known for doing at Essos, of cutting off the feet of deserters that are fleeing from the company itself? It seems like that's the case, at least for some of the less renowned ones. We don't hear that happening in the Golden Company, but we do hear it happening for the Windblown and for the Bloody Members.
It's all about the spectacle of fearsome acts, and that's how these brutal men stay in charge of equally brutal men. And we see that also with the likes of Rorge and Biter and Jaqen H'ghar, the fact that Rorge is afraid of Jaqen. And, that actually explains why he and Biter go along with Jaqen's plan on Arya 9, because otherwise Rorge and Biter just kind of pop up there, and you wonder just what their agency is. But it does make sense. If Rorge is intimidated by Jaqen, he would probably come at his beck and call.
Do you think there's like something that like Jaqen said to these guys that was like, or just like threatened them in some way that just like kind of like broke through them? Because for all of their many, many faults, Rorge and Biter don't seem like afraid of shit. The only thing they seem to be afraid of is Jaqen H'ghar. So what is exactly he did? They
were in the black cells with him. He could have done anything.
I feel like he must have changed his face.
They probably saw that. Yeah.
It would have terrified them. Yeah. So good. So a fun one in this otherwise dark and miserable chapter. 3 of the houses mentioned as marching out of Harrenhal are actually references to comic book characters. Yes, George, as we were saying before, was the original OG when it comes to comic books. And this is a reference that Elio Garcia from Westeros.org compiled. The Citadel site, if you guys take a chance or are interested in reading the site, it's a good site to take a look at. So Elio writes, Black Hood, Blue Beetle, and Green Arrow, a reference to comic books, specifically the Archie comics superhero, the Black Hood, and the DC comics superheroes, Blue Beetle and Green Arrow. A variation of this appeared where the Black Hood was replaced by Thunderbolts, which has been speculated to be a reference to the DC characters The Flash, who is, with the Blue Beetle and the Green Arrow, a member of the Justice League of America, and or Johnny Thunderbolt of the Justice Society of America. Martin has been a comic book fan from early in life. No shit.
One of the more blatant of the many little bits of comic book references in the Song of Ice and Fire, but it's just a great contrast if you have these emblems of heroes like, Green Arrow and Blue Beetle, and then Gregor Clegane shows up. So you're like, oh God, what kind of superheroes would be in the company of a man like Gregor Clegane? Which gets back to the question with which we started this episode. How is it that these men are coexisting in the same army? And I think George might be hinting at that with that superhero imagery.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I just kind of think it's worth just pointing out, Arya's kind of serious thought if she should use her kill on Hot Pie for cottoning onto her identity. And it's, it's not serious as in like, she really considers it, but it is something that occurs to her. And I think that idea, this is a kid who's traveled with her whole, like he's been along the whole journey, and is gonna be there with her going forward. And it's I think foreshadowing as to the coldness and the lack of connection that Arya is going to eventually kind of thrive on, sadly.
When you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And when you have the ability to kill at will, suddenly everyone starts looking like fresh corpses, don't they? And that's a question of how you handle that kind of power. And that takes us, I think, into our discussion portion of this episode. We want to talk about, obviously we're set up very strong in this chapter. Oh, Arya should have used her wish elsewhere. And it's worth discussing, well, how should she have? Who could she have killed? And how does the fandom kind of talk about this issue or not talk about this issue?
It's a fascinating question because it gets brought up again in the next Arya chapter. Is it going to be Tywin Lannister? Is it going to be Gregor Clegane? Is it going to be King Joffrey? Say a name, speak a name, girl, and a man will die. This is it's an interesting question. What Arya should have used her second wish for? Like, who is like the actual? And I think the question kind of comes down to who is the actual source of power that could. If Arya uses that wish against one person, what is it that disrupts like their war plans against the Starks? What is it that actually impacts the war in a positive way for Robb and Catelyn and her brothers up north? I think you can make a strong case for Tywin Lannister. I think you can make a less strong case for Joffrey, given that he is somewhat controlled by Cersei and Tyrion, somewhat, very loosely controlled by them at some points, as we're going to discover in the next Tyrion chapter. But I do think that there's also the question of why Arya doesn't get blamed for misusing this wish. And I think it's a good point to kind of ask our guest McCall about this kind of dichotomy between a character like Sansa or Catelyn and their mistakes and why they kind of are repeatedly why they're repeatedly analyzed by this fandom and why this doesn't occur for Arya in this chapter.
Yeah, I want to presage this by saying that it is completely understandable that a child makes a mistake like this. Like, I do not begrudge Arya for not, thinking in the long run. But it is not the hardest leap to make. Tywin is right there. And, it's I don't know. There's a certain degree of like, you do have time to think about this. So, okay. But I just think the contrast between like, the kind of, everybody kind of shrugs this off, and the fandom is big. Not everybody shrugs it off, but like from what I've seen, it's sort of barely an issue. Like, people don't bring that up as a mark against Arya, whereas like the most minuscule sins that Catelyn and Sansa, perform are Sansa telling a woman that she trusts deeply, that she's been, guided by her family and whatever to trust a basic timeline of her father's plans, is like considered one of the primal sins in this series. And Arya having the ability to stop the war is kind of never really raised as a point against her. Although again, I don't emotionally blame her, but I think that it's worth, if Arya is kind of a super child, and it's worth thinking about where that is, people kind of want, I think, to enjoy that without necessarily thinking about all of the consequences and ways that the story has to change around that.
I think a lot of people find it easier to empathize with misapplied strength than with weakness, which I think is unfortunate because, weakness is universal. So I think people look at a mistake like Sansa going to Cersei, and that's a mistake that feels to some people like something giving way. And they look at Arya killing Wiese as something good that was aimed wrong. And I'm not trying to obviously there's no perfect empathy machine, and no one's going to apply empathy equally to each character. But I think there's something, I think there's something easier to gravitate towards for some people, I think, about the dramatic possibilities of violence going astray versus a person giving way to inner demons in a way that isn't as actiony or isn't as dramatic or climactic, even though it's a similar decision. And I think to, give the benefit of that, a lot of it is because Arya, like if you just paused Arya and Sansa and like it took still photographs and said which one of these people is suffering more, you'd say Arya. because she's the one covered in dirt and running around and doing labor. But, Sansa, so much of what she goes through isn't apparent from the outside or is being shielded from the public. And I think maybe part of the consequences of that is for the reader, who are, we ourselves an audience, a viewing public. I think for some people, Arya's pain is just more raw and immediate and bitter in a way that I think is part of the writing style. And I think that's unfortunate. People shut themselves off to Sansa deliberately, but I think they are responding to a difference in style that is part of the text. Like, with Arya, you are shoved in the face of Arya's pain in a way you are not for a lot of other POVs.
I think that's it. Go ahead, McCall.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I'm always just a little bit wary around this because I think that the sympathy toward Arya that is totally justified and worthwhile, and I agree is cultivated by George, combined with the idea that she's some kind of like Wonderkin's badass, does blind a lot of people to the real darkness and dangerous elements of her story. And I think her arc is one of like, oh, this is so badass, this is so bad, oh god, like at a certain point it stops being badass and starts being horrific. And I think George is taking us down that road, but I think that people don't necessarily see that. I think people get stuck in their, book 1 and book 2 perceptions of the characters a lot of the time. That includes Sansa, and that includes Catelyn. I'm convinced there are people who just have not read past Catelyn, whenever she says the mean thing to Jon, and it's just like, they just stop. So I think it's basically continue to evaluate the characters that you are, reading and commenting on and connecting to.
Yeah, I think there's like something to be said too with this idea that when Sansa is interacting with her environment, she's interacting with it in a feminine way, which kind of Arya is not. Arya has his reputation for being a tomboy, but as we talked about in this chapter, we see Arya as feminine in her own way, just different from the way that Sansa is feminine. And I'm not a great expert at femininity, as you might have already guessed.
You'll get there.
Someday. I mean, I have 2 daughters and then 1 wife, so I think I'll eventually get there. So I'm a little outnumbered in my own household, but I do think there's something to be said for that distinction, which people tend to gravitate towards someone who can like just kind of strike out against like the wrong people, the wrongdoers in a physical, violent type of way. I think Sansa does have this ability, and we start to see it develop in Clash, and especially in Storm and A Feast for Crows, of striking back against the people who are against her oppressors. I mean, we saw a very horrific way that Sansa was treated in Sansa's 3rd chapter, where she's stripped naked and beaten by the Kingsguard members. But she's not the person that has Jaqen H'ghar that can like bring justice to Boris Blunt and bring justice to Joffrey Baratheon. She has her charm and her ability to try to save her own skin in the moment. But I think like what we're also seeing too, and which gets really expanded upon, thankfully, in A Storm of Swords, is this ability of kind of the woman's ability to use power in a specific feminine way. The woman, what she witnesses with the Tyrells doing in King's Landing in A Storm of Swords, and taking that mentality and utilizing it in a really strong way. Come the Winds of Winter, their sample chapter from Elaine 1, where she's utilizing her feminine wiles and charms in order to not manipulate, to inspire people to want to come to her side. She's able to draw an army around herself in a way that's not her like killing someone and being like, look at me, the badass, I'm the person that you want to follow. It's her showing herself as Lady Sansa, or Lady Elaine at that point, bastard daughter of Littlefinger, but eventually soon to be revealed as Sansa of House Stark. And that I think that is a strong way that George does really good development for both these characters. So I do think that there is an aspect of contrasting and comparing Arya and Sansa, but they are different. But they are able to utilize power in their own specific special way, and are able to utilize their ability to strike back against their oppressors in their own unique styles. And I think that's a really good way that George writes A Song of Ice and Fire and writes these characters of Sansa and Arya.
Oh, they're both blades. They're definitely both blades, and they're just sheathed in different ways.
And to get back to the question of the second wish, I mean, maybe Arya should have killed Edmure. What if Edmure's not in command of the Battle of the Forest? Doesn't Tywin march into the west but doesn't that produce the day is saved? I think I get to the difficulty of these questions. Because if you kill Tywin, maybe Kevon just steps into his place and all the same things happen. Really who she should name is Euron, but she doesn't know that Euron exists, and the reader barely does at this point either.
Wait, guys, she should kill George.
She should kill George. Yeah, exactly. Kill God. Kill the author. But
Kill God.
I think what we're being shown is the ability to kill 3 individuals. Ugh, that's just nothing against the sheer weight of injustice she's running up against.
Yeah.
All of it is being hidden away and washed away by the war. 3 people. What's 3 people? It's the inverse of what's saving Rorgen, Biter, and Jaqen. And she's come to feel kind of so bittersweet about that. It didn't mean that much to her in the end, and then the 3 deaths mean the same to her. It's like when she hears about Joffrey dying. But Robb died too, so what does it matter? And that changing relationship to death is so crucial to Arya's story, and it's something that's crucial to Sansa's story too, just in a different way and from a different angle. And they'll have different angles to bring back to each other when they come back, different angles on the same ideas, and that's part of what any good relationship is bringing different angles to the same idea, like we do here on the podcast.
On the podcast. I absolutely agree. I think it's a great way to kind of close out this episode. So thank you to everyone for listening. For those of you who are watching on the live stream, and McCall, you're welcome to stick around for this. We do a little Q&A kind of chat session with folks as they're
totally
commenting. So you're welcome to stick around for that. And that'll be awesome. If you have the chance, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, Podbean, Spotify, anywhere and everywhere where you find our podcasts.
You can check out our Patreon at patreon.com/NotaCastASOIAF. You can follow us on Twitter at NotaCastASOIAF or shoot us an email at NotaCastASOIAF@gmail.com. You can find me at Poor Quentin on Twitter or at PoorQuentin.com.
And you can find me at Brendan Beefish on Twitter, Brendan Beefish on Reddit, and my website is warsandpoliticsspiceandfire.wordpress.com.
We want to shout out and thank our high lords and ladies on Patreon: Lord of the Squishers and Warden of the Deep, Lady of 1,000 Words, Septon Eastwood of Introvert Isle, Septon Maribald, the Shoeless Sage, Sister Winter, Lady of the Wolfswood, Nessie the Elusive, Warden of the Neck, Defender of the North, and Keeper of Secrets, Sandy the Dragon, Blood of Queen Daenerys and Lady of Jameson, Lady Britt, Bastard Mistress of Harrenhal, Sir Thomas the Raven Knight, Lord of Blackwood, Sir Tim the Knight, who was guided by voices, Lady Dillsdale, the Star Spear of Crescent Hill, Sir Way, of course, Matt, Warden of the Sanguine Shore, Lord Mark Connington, heir to Griffin's Roost, Lord Sam Kay, Sir Michael Mertens, who asked us our question this week, Wisdom Benjicott, Alchemist of Sets and Quanta, Mage of the Arts of Pool and de Morgan, Tibbs the Great of House Catnapping, Lord J. Manderley, Baker of the Frey Pies, Septon, Merriful Head of Hair, Lady Silverring, Joe Snow, King of the Metro North and Protector of the Tri-State, and Kaboth the Unfrozen, Lord of the Bricks and Castle Crimson Light. Thank you so much to all our high lords and ladies.
Absolutely. Thank you all very much. And thank you also to McCall for joining us for this week's episode. And we wanted to give you the chance to talk about where we can find you on the online and all the different stuff that you are involved in.
Ooh, okay. So, first of all, thank you so much for having me back. This was awesome, as always.
Yeah.
You can find me on Twitter at InkAsRain. You can find a lot of my writing at hypeable.com. And you can find my podcasts at Nice Jewish Fangirls. We are continuing to plow on with the Vassals of Kingsgrave. We're doing a Harry Potter reread. We just finished our great linear reread of A Song of Ice and Fire. I recently started doing the podcast of Surprise, which is a Witcher podcast with Aziz and Kyle. Yeah, Aziz from History of Westeros and Kyle from Azora Hype, which has been really fun. And we're going to be live this Friday with the 3rd story in The Last Wish. We're doing that once a week. And then I also have a little vanity project, which is called Gotta Believe, which is imagining the 2020 Mets baseball season as though it had really happened and was not cut off by coronavirus. So if you're a baseball fan, I would please check it out. Nobody listens to it, and I write almost every day. So yeah, that's kind of my current rainbow of positions on the internet place.
Well, that's awesome. I will have to check out the baseball podcast because I'm missing baseball right now. Though I'm a Baltimore Orioles fan, so I'll have to.
Well, we haven't played the Orioles yet, so we haven't really said anything mean about them. The Yankees, we've said plenty of mean things about.
Perfectly fine. Okay, we're on. Yeah, that's super easy. Yeah, we're on the same sheet of music there. Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us, McCall. That's awesome. We had a lot of fun doing this podcast with you, and we will definitely have you back for future episodes. Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So join us next week as we return to a run for Catelyn 5, in which Brienne swears herself to Catelyn's service. Edmure prepares for battle against Lord War Criminal Tywin Lannister, and Ned's bones pass through on their way home. And thankfully they're going to make it there fine, right? Like next Catelyn chapter?
they'll just be right there very smoothly. Everything is going fine up at Winterfell. But yes, Catelyn 5, another beautiful Catelyn chapter. Another reason Catelyn is my favorite POV in A Clash of Kings. There's so much great stuff to talk about with that chapter.
Mm-hmm. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you to McCall again for joining us. Thank you to our patrons for supporting us. And we will see you guys literally next time.
Okay, stop recording.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, McCall, and thanks everyone for watching and for hanging around. We appreciate you as always.
Good episode. I enjoyed it. Yeah. Like we were saying beforehand that like this is like almost like the perfect, not the perfect episode. This is like the perfect just right episode because it includes so many of our interests and across the aisle. So it's all good stuff.
A nice sweet spot for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I kind of skimmed past when you were talking about like the Lannister numbers. I was like, okay, that's Jeff material. I'm not getting involved in that.
Exactly. Not out of disrespect, but out of
out of respect. Yeah.
Jeff
like
knows.
when you're talking about magic and stuff like that, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to learn something here. I'm going to sit back and I'm going to learn what's going on with the magical world of A Song of Ice and
You have to fix something. You don't watch. You let them do their work. They know what they're doing. You got to be proper about it.
Exactly.
Absolutely. So our first question is not a question. It's many people are saying this in the chat, and so we figured that we would let everyone know, and Frank know specifically that Frank, you got to study for your law. What's the law test called again?
The bar.
Yeah, the bar, right? Yeah, get back to studying at the bar.
Right. Frank kicked himself off Twitter. Bless Frank. Or he had his friend kick him. It's just a wonderful weird world, law school. I feel like me at law school is like the opening of Willy Wonka when they're all in the candy store and then it's like Charlie on the outside looking in. That's me with law school. Like part of me has always wanted to go and the other part of me goes like, no, that's hell. Why would you ever do that to yourself? So bless Frank. I know he's through a lot of studying.
And congratulations on. I'm assuming like you have to actually pass law school in order to take the bar. I'm assuming that's the chronology. So congratulations on graduating from law school.
Frank has worked super hard. So we love him despite his wrong opinions about most things.
All right. Yes, and he says he deserves this. Yes, you do. Get back to studying.
That's just you could just screenshot that for Frank at anything. I deserve this.
Somebody screenshot that right now.
Response.
One of you fools will leave it up here for another 10 seconds. Someone screenshot and put it on Twitter where you can't
Frank
see it.
died for our sins.
Mm-hmm. All right. First question from Clint, who is absolutely not a Blackfire spy on the small council. He asks, what if
I'm
Arya
very
actually...
interested in this plot line, by the way. I really hope it continues, and I cannot wait to see where it goes.
There's so many like subcutaneous plot threads going on in the council every week. I love it.
Mm-hmm. So Clint asks, what if Arya actually was guided by the old gods to kill Wiese? Why would they do that? So there's an interesting part of this chapter where Arya thinks for a moment that she's being guided, like her footsteps are being guided by the old gods to go to the bathhouse itself. So maybe she was actually guided by the old gods at some level to go kill Wiese. Why would the old gods want to do that, though? It's a better question.
Maybe they want to do that so it reveals to her how useless this is, so she'll stop going down the Jaqen path. I don't know. Maybe the old gods are tricky like that.
Or maybe the old gods were like, wait, we didn't mean that one.
Like, take that one back.
Blood Raven was on the toilet for that and he wasn't paying attention. Oh no. Pretty much classic Blood Raven.
Bran gets back from his meal of, eating of Jojen, and he's just like, wait, which one did she do?
She killed who now? Oh no. It's supposed to be Littlefinger.
Not him. Good question. All right. ASOF Geek U asks, what is Sanders' fate in the books? Because it's unlikely he'll join the Brotherhood Without Banners because of the different trajectories they're on. And Clegane feels like character regression. Maybe we won't see him again.
McCall, what say you?
Oh, we will almost certainly see him again.
Agreed.
His fate is probably technically this. I mean, look. I'm a Sansa and the Hound fan.
You don't.
However way you want.
No.
Go on.
So I hope that he winds up being her, loyal sworn sword. That said,
you could say.
You know what? No judgment.
It's a judgment-free zone.
I do think that actually Clegane, as it was in the show, was a regression because he very clearly makes a choice and then goes to fight Gregor for literally no reason. But I think it's all in the motivation. Like if there's an actual good reason to fight Gregor in protection of someone or whatever, Sansa, whatever, then no, it wouldn't be a character aggression. But the whole point is that he does have to move past the motivating factor being his own vengeance, and then
right,
and then we're all good.
Because I'm always conflicted on this, because part of me is like, well, sometimes people do just collapse back in on themselves. Like, that does happen.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, like, Sandor specifically, like, he already had the chance to fight Gregor in book 1, and George took the time to write, Sandor did not take any cuts at Gregor's unprotected face. Like, we've already had this. So if it does happen again, it has to be like in a look how far he's come kind of way, like a similar duel, but he's changed so much. I could definitely see that being the case. But in the show, it did feel a certain, like, this is the end point of the character that we always had in mind. And here he is now, even though the way we've written him has evolved completely differently. So that,
I mean, he basically tells Arya, like, there's no reason for me to do this. I'm just going there. This is in the script.
So, yeah, there is that. So, yeah, it's lacking a little. I get the structure, but it's lacking a little bit of the flavor.
I do think that him joining the Brotherhood of Banners is a possibility. I think that's something we might see in the Winds of Winter, because I do think
whatever extent they're still around.
Right. I mean, all roads point to the north, and I think there's a method that you would have, the Hound dying and Sandor rising from the dead, joining with Lady Stoneheart, who was Catelyn, who has risen from the dead as Stoneheart, as a kind of narrative paralleling, which we could see in the Winds of Winter.
Sure, I could see that. I don't know. Stoneheart's just like the negative of that, though. So
true.
She might have to die. I have a hard time believing Stoneheart's going to go north and be part of anything, useful or helpful in any way. I don't see that happening. I think she has to go first. Agreed there.
Okay. SKNC asks, do you think there are any #men writing women moments in A Song of Ice and Fire?
You've read the sex scenes in these books, right?
Yeah.
Who were those for? Do you think?
I mean, Asha's scene from A Dance of Dragons, which we cited last week. That's
book 5, man.
That's George very self-consciously going, okay, write a sex scene from a woman's perspective. Write a sex scene from a woman's perspective. Write a sex scene from a woman's perspective. I can do this. And he did it. But it took that long to get there. So, yeah, I mean, it's everyone has difficulty writing outside their comfort zone to a greater or lesser degree, and everyone has their own definition of what that comfort zone is. We all just got to push it as best we can. And so I say with love, there are definitely moments where it's very much George going, yes, this is what a capital woman with a capital W would say and think in this situation. There are moments with Ariane's dialogue with Eris Oakhart and that one sex scene chapter sometimes feel very much like what George's idea of what a woman would say in this moment, not the character he has crafted saying in this moment. But yeah, good Lord, you want to see some scenes I've written that definitely have similar problems. So I'm not judging.
I can't wait. And I have a copy of your book that is on my
I try.
Tribe. I'm gonna have to it's a good.
But what about you two? What other moments come to mind in this particular saga?
Anytime he talks about breasts, small firm breasts, pointy breasts,
very much breasts from the perspective of someone looking at them rather than look at them.
And there's that funny thing that's a little old online now. It's like, do men know that women don't just like stand in front of mirrors and look at our breasts?
No, we're convinced you do this every morning while the camera zooms out slowly.
I would do, right?
Over in the back, this is what we imagine. Really.
Yeah. And it's so funny too, because like there are parts of the female experience that George nails,
Sure.
Like Sansa's period scene is amazing. And then he just keeps going back to these like, 90s tropes. And it's just like, dude,
Yeah, it does feel like falling back. Because, you get like moments with Catelyn that are just like her exhaustion just feels so real and lived in. But yeah, other moments do feel like behind glass. And that's, that's a great reminder that like, no artist has like one way of doing things or one thing they're good or bad at. It really varies on the character and the moment. And, I think George is probably all too aware of that.
Yeah. I think you guys nailed it. I don't really have anything to add on the question. I think it's a good question. I think George does better than most of his peers. I think we can stipulate that.
The bar is low.
True. That's true.
Genre.
If you guys didn't know, fantasy is mostly written by men. I know it's a surprise
Very
to many
specifically
of you.
men trying to deal with the fact that women don't want to be around them through the act of writing these books. Which there are worse ways to deal with the fact that women don't like you, like, murdering lots of people. So writing a sexist fantasy novel is not the worst way of dealing with that, but it's kind of embarrassing in the genre. The bar is low. That's what I say about Shay, too. She's not my favorite character in The Song of Ice and Fire, but the bar for sex workers in fantasy stories is so low as it is.
Yeah. And then there's the whole George thing where, like, sometimes it's like, well, it's bad, but is he trying to make it bad because it's making a point? And,
Right, exactly. You can just hear him going, the definition of satire, according to Webster's dictionary. There are moments
it's a deconstruction.
Don't you get it? It's deep because it's not. Duh. Yeah. And again, every creative person has moments like that. So
Yeah, for sure.
Not me. Micmac asks, would John have had a better upbringing at Winterfell had he grown up believing he was Benjen's son? Would his relationship with Kat and her children be different? Wasn't Benjen like 13 or 12 or 13 years old when John is born? I mean, he's pretty young at that point. So it seems like Ned would.
He wasn't at war. That would make it. I mean, Ned comes home with the baby.
Right.
I think that's going to be hard to pull off. I think if he'd been, let's say Ned pretends he's Lord Dustin's bastard and he died in the war, so I'm going to foster him here at Winterfell. Something. If there wasn't that like pain for Catelyn and that question about, John's political aims. Yeah, his relationship with Catelyn would have been probably much easier. I'm curious if his relationship with the other Stark kids would have been different if they never thought of him as a sibling. But, I think, for Ned, whatever the details of what the promise Lyanna gave him, he interpreted it as raise John as your son. And I think he would find it very difficult emotionally to do anything else, even if that would have made it easier on John, which is like, that's the great contradiction. Like Ned is so hurt by what he's lost. He's actually making it harder on John, but he really can't realize that.
Yeah, agreed. Guilty Undertake asks, who did more damage to House Stark, Tywin Lannister or Roose Bolton, whom Arya is barely aware of at this point?
¿Por qué no los dos?
I mean, Tywin at least is planning on sending a half Stark baby home at some point, like Tyrion and Sansa's kid, whereas Roose has a not Stark that he is married to Ramsay. So I guess Roose is doing more damage. Technically, I think Roose is the one who would be fine with House Stark never again existing at all, and Tywin wants a branch of them still to exist, completely under his control. So neither of those are good things. But Roose has the one who has the incentive, I think, to wipe them off the face of the planet. So I guess Roose is more dangerous.
And the desire too. I mean, we know historically that the Boltons and the Starks fought wars for hundreds, if not thousands of years on and off. So for supremacy on the north and who would be the actual kings in the north of the Kings of Winter. So the Lannister Stark conflict is like all of about 17 years old, if you want to count what Ned and Tywin are kind of at loggerheads at the end of Robert's Rebellion for that little incident of sacking King's Landing and, of course, murdering thousands of people. I mean, it's a relatively
much more personal, not like the institutional millennia of history that the Starks and the Boltons have. Absolutely.
Yeah. It gets back to your point about how Tywin wants to send Sansa and Tyrion back to the north. So he's not looking to destroy House Stark in order to put his own house in the place of the Starks. He wants to kind of fuse the Starks and the Lannisters together into one kind of entity.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really pick, but I just, anytime we talk about the Boltons, like I do think that there's, like, obviously Roose Bolton's not a vampire, and neither was Snape. But I think part of the reason people get drawn to ideas like that, aside from the fact that he's just so creepy and the Dreadfort is so creepy, is that there is that weird like ancientness to this. There's the feeling that the Boltons have just been, lying in wait underneath the Starks' beds, and like waiting to suck them dry. And, it's...
Then you also have Dumb Eric, who seemed like a nice enough guy.
Yeah.
Did you say Dumb Eric or Domeric?
Well, his name is Dumb Eric, but it's Dumb Eric is what
suddenly I was like, yeah, wait.
Some friends of ours call him, and it's like that's what I just jumped in on now. But yeah, I mean, that's the idea of the Boltons, and some of them live up to it, and some of them don't. But Ramsay really loves that idea of being a Bolton, and so he tries to live up to it even more than Roose does, really. And so it's that idea that they keep chasing. and that that idea has that ancient history with House Stark.
Agreed. All right. Sir Frank B., who should be studying for the bar, get back to fucking studying, dude, says, building off of McCall's how much is George R. R. Martin commenting by being bad, how much of A Song of Ice and Fire is George R. R. Martin's intent or just fans reading too much into things? The quote, curtains are just blue, not sorrow trope that we find in literature.
It's definitely... I think the point at which you are reading too far into things is not necessarily determined by author intent. I think you can go beyond author intent and still be delivering worthwhile criticism. I think once you've just run out of interesting things to say, then I think you've reached the no point of criticism, and I think that's going to vary for each person. But I mean, I think you can make it. If you can make it what you're doing seem like more than detail mongering than it is, you know what I mean? If you have a strong enough narrative to your theory or your idea about the text, and it takes hold of people, then I think that ultimately matters more than whether George intended it. But if you come off like you're just torturing one word into eternity, it's an evanescent border. But I think it's whether you're still enjoying the text as art, or whether you just reduced it to this series of signifiers that you're solving. And I think no one really knows when you've crossed that line but you. But I mean, one of the reasons I still love doing this podcast is I feel like we've never crossed that line, and we haven't become just like joyless, like, here's the crumb of this that will fit this. And there's a lot of content creators who I feel like just kind of do that. And I think that's just not interesting. And I think that border is subjective, which is why I'm struggling to define it. But I think that's what's important to me.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think there's, I think, here's what I think. I think if you're like getting your enjoyment from A Song of Ice and Fire through like uncovering the secret meaning, like the secret meaning underneath of everything, I think you had a really good quote about this. You were quoting someone on Twitter, Emmett, yesterday or the day before, about how, if you're like looking for the secret hidden meanings of analysis, like that kind of undercuts some of the meat of what we're actually doing. What you shouldn't be looking you shouldn't be looking for the hidden meanings more than, I guess I'm butchering the quote that you quote retreated about, but I'm sure you can pull it up if you want to. But I'm
not sure which one it was exactly, but I mean, for me, it's like, you want to unlock reservoirs of emotion, not just like I solved the thing. Like when I see videos like we solved the Twin Peaks, like my soul dies. Like that's not what you're supposed to do when you watch Twin Peaks. Is solve it. You're supposed to feel it, and if you're not doing that, then I think if you're not using the tools of analysis to try to deepen and understand your emotions, then I think you've gone off the wrong track. But that's just me personally.
Right, as always. Well,
damn right.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you approach, especially if you're used to doing it, like I joked about being an English major before, but like there's a certain degree of close reading that like is bullshit and you put in your paper anyway because you need the words. Yep, and then there's a certain amount of close reading that you're like, I don't think the author meant this, but I still think it's cool. And like that's, to me, like that's what reading is for. That's what books are for, like they don't evaporate once you've read them for a reason, and yeah. And
sometimes you need a bullshit bridge to get you to the emotional place
you're
trying to get. Sometimes you're just kind of stranded out there with a flashlight and you see what you come up with. And I think that's perfectly fine.
And I think it's, just to be fair, if like you're like finding stuff in the narrative, and like George does put a lot of mysteries and things like that, and he does do a lot of wordplay in order to do foreshadowing and stuff like that, that's totally fine. I just think that if you're not enjoying the books for as they are and what their emotional appeal is to you, and you're looking for the secret hidden meaning of each and every sentence, then you're probably taking a little bit too far.
Yeah. If I could recommend an author who I think does this really well, in terms of like building layers of meaning into a lot of her sentences, Megan Whelan Turner, who wrote the Queen's Thief series. Have you read those, Emmett?
I have not, but I've had it recommended to me.
Oh my God, they're
before,
so
I'll have to now.
Yeah, the problem is you can't, like, not everybody gets them on the first read, and
oh good, I love them already.
You can't read them just once. Because like every time you reread them, oh my God, like seriously, I've read them multiple times, and sometimes I'm like, oh my God, this comma, and they're just really fun, and but you get the emotions right away, so it's so good.
Well, that's what I love. It's I don't want to have to necessarily choose between like emotional and intellectual achievements in literature. I want them to both be there, and I want them to be feeding off each other. And this, having them separate at all maybe is not the way to think about it.
Yeah.
Eric brings up the quote that I was thinking of.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm able to shake my students' belief that what we're doing is finding, quote, hidden meanings in a text rather than improving the quality of attention we're giving it.
Yeah, you are the one who's changing. And I think that should be kept in mind always with analysis, that stories ultimately are there to crack you open rather than you being there to, you should. I know myself better because of thinking about A Song of Ice and Fire. I really do. Like the process of thinking deeply about it and writing deeply about it has made me aware of my own blind spots and my own thought patterns in a way that it helps. And I think that trying to shine that flashlight on yourself is really important. And not just unlock what Melville was really trying to say in the 13th graph of this particular page of Moby Dick. No, just step back and let the size of Moby Dick wash over you, and then go back and start feeling. But keep the size of it in your head.
Yeah.
I mean, literary criticism exists because people do this. Like, it's,
True.
we're not alone, and we're not like unique in this. It's people overread stuff they like and they make stuff up about it. And sometimes that really works. And there are, pages and pages of Shakespearean interpretation that, like, you go back to the beginning and you're like, this is actually a little thin on the ground. But I really like the end, the point that they come to and what it contributes to your understanding of the play. So.
Sure. And because artists are themselves critics. I mean, so many of the great French New Wave film directors started as film critics. So many great authors, corresponded with their heroes, wrote in literary magazines, wrote articles, they tried to understand a book and before as part of the process of creating their own. And I think that's something Jeff and I are both, in the middle of trying to do. So I think that's a powerful part of it.
I think and I'll just say one more point and then we'll move on to more Song of Ice and Fire questions. But I think and I made this point somewhat recently, but I was going through and trying to do another round of editing. McCall, eventually I will take a look at your pitch letter edits that you gave me, 6 months ago. But
right. You just have only time right now. So
yes, and it's all ending at, there's a finite point where it all ends for me. My death, essentially. But anyways,
damn.
Well, just get a little bit deep there.
God, was the one who got dark on this
But I think doing this podcast with you, Emmett, and has made me a better writer as well as a better reader, and has allowed me to not just look at A Song of Ice and Fire as just a series of puzzle boxes. I got to figure this part out. Why? Here are the 50 clues.
By J.J. Abrams. Yep.
Right. Here are the 50 clues why Lyanna is Jon Snow's mother. Sort of thing. Where it's more impactful to look at the emotionality of the impact of Ned's decisions and what was possibly going through Lyanna and Rhaegar's mind, and how it's going to impact Jon in the future. How that's much more prescient and much more powerful, emotionally impactful than finding all of the hidden clues that are in the narrative. Which, again, is not a bad thing. It's just a better way, I think, of looking at literature than what we're doing. All right.
I mean, it's fun to put a piece of the puzzle together, but then you got to step back and look at the puzzle and go, "Wow, that's beautiful." And if you don't do that, then I think you've missed something crucial.
100%. All right. Micah asks, what do you guys think of Flemont Brax, one of Tywin's bannermen who might not be as vicious as the others? He hasn't had much attention, but when he was sad about his dead dad, it caught my eye weirdly.
The Westerlands nobles get barely any attention, which I think is interesting. Maybe because there's just so much attention on the Lannisters themselves. But yeah, I mean, right. He's the one whose dad dies in the Battle of the Camps.
Right.
Yeah, we're really not giving much time with any of these guys, honestly. Adam Marbrand is the one we spent a little bit of time with, and maybe then he's just the idea of a good guy, basically. The Westerlands nobles, also because we don't spend any time in the Westerlands. That might help.
I mean, I think we're gonna we could be fairly confident Westerman at some level will show up in the Winds of Winter prologue as it's going to occur, because Jane Westerly is going to make an appearance, so we might learn a little bit more about internal Westerland's politics of these guys, which would be fun, I think. But yeah, I don't really have a lot of thoughts about Flemont Brax, or at least we were actually kind of bouncing ideas back and forth for this episode about what we're going to do for a major discussion. My idea was whence goes the West in the Winds of Winter, and I was sitting there be like, who do we actually care about out in the West? Adam Marbrand, I guess. Strongboar. He seems interesting. The concept of Strongboar Craig Hall seems like an interesting character, but yeah, I think we had a better topic anyways. But we'll probably eventually do that at some point. But yeah, Clint brings up a great point. My thought on Flemont Brax, his name is fucking metal. Yeah, agreed. Any thoughts about the Westerlands, McCall?
Literally none.
I mean, so we talked about this when we were talking about Tyrion's last chapter in A Game of Thrones, how like all of these Westerman lords, how they all sort of assume this kind of faceless mentality because Tywin has just corralled them in such a way that their opinions and thoughts on things really don't matter at all because Tywin is such a massive presence. And it's very different in Rob's camp where every single Northern Lord is extremely memorable in different ways. And that's because Rob has cultivated a leadership style, and I think Ned before him, that allowed for these guys to have their own voices in war councils and in the politics of the North.
That's a great point.
But I mean, like I think part of this is I think even George has emotional limitations, and there's only so many people who can be fully realized, and
Oh, sure.
I have no idea who that is that you mentioned, but I'm sure he like has a very moving moment, and it's humanizing and whatever. But at the same time, like I don't, especially now, when like POV contraction is important. Like I don't necessarily expect the future books to be full of like unexpected humanity in the Lannister line,
Sure. Well, I think we might get that in the prologue, like Jeff was saying, which is often what the prologue is for. Little glimpses of the humanity that, by necessity, gets ignored in the rest of the story. We get one wildling POV in the prologue. We get a couple small folk POVs in the prologues. Right back to our regularly scheduled programming. So, yeah, I think
our maester.
That'll be our little empathy machine for the Westerlands. I think we'll be watching them get torn apart by wolves. Prologue to the Winds of Winter.
Sorry, I'm not laughing. I'm laughing with them.
There
not
you
after.
go.
All right, SKNCS. The first time you read the books, who did you think was Jon Snow's mother?
I remember being like, I'll find out about that at some point.
Same.
I guess. I don't think I remember. I don't think I didn't just realize it was a thing I was supposed to think about. You know what I mean? I wasn't like thinking, oh, that's the big mystery of the story, clearly. So I think I learned about R + L = J at the same time as I learned this was even a thing to speculate about. You know what I mean? There was no space in which I was speculating about this before I learned about R + L = J. If I tried to zap my brain back to zero, I mean, Ashara Dane is being pretty clearly set up as a red herring, so I might fall for her. I think that's what you're supposed to do.
Chloe just stood up and turned her face toward you. In whatever
Ashara Dane was mentioned. But Ned also throws in Wyla to throw people off the tracks. So
I was thinking Wyla, I think probably because I had seen the first two seasons of the show before I read the books. And so I was like, okay, Wyla, that was brought up in like episode 2 or 3 of the show. So Wyla is Jon Snow's mom. But then I think when it got brought up again by Ned Dane in A Storm of Swords, I was like, okay, I guess this is something I'm supposed to like kind of wonder about. And again, I think I've told the story several times. This is like the first theory that I heard about. So my brother, after I was finished at Dance with Dragons, like, so who do you think that Jon Snow's mom is? I'm like, Wyla? He's like, no, try again.
I do not remember. I read the books in 2004, I think. And it was
OG.
Yeah,
same. You and Emma are OG.
Yeah,
before
it's kind of fun. You had to go under M for Martin in the bookstore. But I don't know. My sister read them slightly before I did, and she was kind of like guiding my path through the first 3 books that were out at the time. So I think she might have like introduced that idea to me. I do know she told me about the Red Wedding, which I think was actually a good thing because.
Is that right? Okay.
Man, I can only take so much. She definitely told me a lot of the first book. It's actually weird. I have a very distinct memory of her like reading this thick fantasy book and her like screaming from the basement and me being like, what's wrong? And she being like, he killed the main character. And I was like, oh,
That sounds unfortunate.
Yeah, exactly. 15 years later.
Exactly. Smash cut.
Yeah.
All right. This one goes to Emmett. At PQ from A Song of Ice and Fire Geek You, after how many rereads did you realize Euron's an eldritch monster? A testament to the writing that it went over people's heads. Quote, surely that is worth a driftwood crown seems a giveaway now.
I remember Maiden Mirror on Tumblr had a good post about Euron that started to get me thinking about a few things, and then I went back and reread. And once I think it was putting Euron in context with the Bloodraven stuff and Dany's dream about him and Dance that really started to get me thinking about him. in terms of the bigger picture. The Bloodraven connection, which is why I always bring it up when the discourse turns to Euron, is really key, not just because, again, it's the puzzle piece that solves his backstory, because it really makes sense of what is otherwise kind of a very free-floating, just amorphous character of dread. Like, if Bloodraven opened his third eye and he's basically evil Bran, I think that provides a lot of structure to his character, so that really locked him into place for me.
Yeah, I think I came through your writing, so I think that was a testament to you. Absolutely.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Maxell asks, it seems George is doing a gradual ramp up of villainy of A Song of Ice and Fire, right? Gregor, Ramsay, now Euron seems to be getting set up next. You think he's got one more in him before the others, or no?
God, I hope not.
I don't think so. I think Euron is the red carpet was for Euron. I mean, Euron is basically trying to transition himself into a White Walker, I think. So it makes perfect sense. He's the logical next step.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, I do wonder if there might be one more personal villain, like Harry the Heir has some red flags planted in his head for me about how he might react around Sansa and stuff like that, or the mouse or whatever. But yeah, I don't think I think it's Euron White Walkers, and maybe there's some bleeding in between there. Yeah,
agree. Well put. And yeah, there's still going to be like small, intimate, petty villains. And, Littlefinger's not dead yet. So, yeah, Cersei's not dead. But, yeah, in terms of, like, the structure of what the idea of a villain is capable of in this universe, which I think, was established pretty strongly with Gregor and changed with Ramsay, and I think it's supposed to change again with Euron.
Mm-hmm. All right. Everyone's been asking us to answer this question from Erin M., one of our poor fellow patrons. She asks, what 3 deaths would have gotten Arya to Winterfell or closest to?
Oh, jeez. That's a good question.
I mean, if she kills Tywin in Harrenhal, basically the army's just going to sit in Harrenhal. She's never going to get out, right? So she can't kill Tywin unless, like, Kevin suddenly decides he's leadership material.
True. Yeah, I mean, killing Wiese definitely helps her escape.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's the thing. Once you're outside of Harrenhal, killing people suddenly becomes a lot less useful as a tool.
She'd have to have Jaqen with her, like on the horse with her.
And like, what would it would be like kill that guy for his horse. I guess that would help. But yeah, I mean that's only within the world of Harrenhal, this closed world where everyone is conveniently horrible. Only there is this 3 death structure really useful, because by getting outside, it's like killing any random person. No, I need I need an inn. I need an inn. I need directions. I need a boat. I don't need a murder genie. Thank you very much.
Whereas for Sansa, actually, I think that because King's Landing is so much more of a closed environment, I do think that maybe the 3 kill option would have helped. I mean, actually, it sort of is. I mean, like, it's Joffrey. It's Dantos, and then according to Littlefinger's plan, it was supposed to be Tyrion.
True. It's a great way of thinking about it. Those 3 deaths ushering her out of the capital.
Littlefinger is Sansa's Jaqen H'ghar. Oy vey.
He's trying to frame himself that way, certainly. I'm your mentor. I am taking care of you. He's very self-conscious in that regard.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And apparently everyone is yelling at me because Erin is not a poor fellow. She is a sworn sword patron. Sorry, Erin. I'm sorry. I apologize in the comments. I'm apologizing.
Guys, they just have so many patrons. They can't keep track.
So many titles. They make you swear and swear.
Swear and swear. Yeah. Sorry about that. Whoops. All right. Mick asks, if Song of Ice and Fire was adapted into a musical TV series, do you think Stannis could pull off singing his I Want song without it coming across as super cheesy or breaking character?
I have theories.
Okay, because I have no fucking idea about this question.
First of all, I definitely want to shout out the amazing Westeros musical.
Yeah.
So that does exist. However, in my personal estimation, well, if you do Stannis like these guys do Stannis, and Proudwing is, a massive part of his, structure as a character, and you understand him through that lens, then yes, he could definitely break out into song. However, in my personal conception of it, he's more delivering like a monologue. I'm trying to think about of something that's sort of like this. I think there are a couple of moments in Hamilton. Yeah, where people are like talking, and there's kind of like piano in the background, and like they're speaking along to the music, but not necessarily singing. So that's my thought. That would be how I would stage
That does
Stannis.
fit. You're a certain amount of cheesiness and unreality is baked into the cake. So, every character is expressing their inner selves and their, in some way. And with Stannis, I think you could have a lot of fun in how much Stannis would not want to be singing. Like you could have him be just a reluctant, before giving way. I think there's a lot of fun things you can do with that. Reluctant characters are sometimes the most fun to play with in a musical context because they don't want to be the ones suddenly singing until they are.
Yeah. But Stannis also, his I want is so close to the surface, honestly,
that's true. He's just a walking, talking I want song. So that's very true.
Again, I got nothing to contribute, so you guys, I'm just assuming you guys blew it out of the water. So awesome job. SKNCS, we'll take a few more questions. Yes, which characters in A Song of Ice and Fire are you the most like, and which characters in A Song of Ice and Fire do you wish you were like?
What a cruel question, truly. How are you not like what you want to be?
Why are you failing?
You are failing to measure up. I want to be Mance and am Edmure. I feel like this is self-explanatory in both counts.
No, you're not Edmure.
Who's next?
You're not Edmure.
I am very much Edmure. I mean, very well, and that's
you're
the
Marwyn.
Best said for
you're
me.
Absolutely Marwyn the Mage.
Marwyn the Mage is I would love to be, but he's more accomplished than I am. He's
not in my heart.
Published a little more effectively.
Not in my heart, sir.
Bless Edmure. He tries his best, and he means well.
He does.
But yeah, I would love to be Mance because Mance is just a badass. Mance just does it's just like everything he does is like, oh, you turned out to be the best at that. How about that? Bless him with the singing and the leading armies. He's just great. I love him.
He really is kind of like a Mary Sue.
He is in a lot of ways. He's one of those
Marty
characters.
Sue. Yeah.
And I love in A Song of Ice and Fire has all these characters where you meet and you go, oh, aren't you the protagonist?
Yes.
You meet Beric and you go, oh, is this whole story about you? Because it seems like it should be.
You're the only one who managed to unite the Wildling clans, and then it's just like,
And then he's just washed away. Stannis shows up like, Pizarro with Incas and goes, nope. And it's just, I mean, Rhaegar is like that too, like this entire fantasy protagonist with all the infrastructure around him gone in the backstory. And I like Mance for that reason. What about you, Jeff? Who are you and who do you wish you would be?
My answer is going to be Edmure as well. So,
we're both Edmure here. It's Edmure 24/7 on the Nauticast.
I feel like we've answered this question before. I'm not mistaken. Yeah, but I mean, Edmure, I guess who I want to be is Ned Stark with a head. I guess a good father and
headful Ned Stark.
Yeah, leader of men. But and actually Edmure. So yeah.
What about you, McCall?
Guys.
I am Sansa. That is. She's from the beginning, even in her bitchiest moments, has been a character who's resonated very deeply with me as somebody who, has a petty side and yet also a lot of creative dreams and things like that, and feels fear at the world and uses structures to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
Sansa. I've never expected to meet a character in a fantasy novel, much less a protagonist like Sansa Stark. There's a lot of like emotional stuff there.
I guess, yeah.
But I kind of wish I was like Catelyn, also pre-Red Wedding. Yeah. It's like Sansa, that competence and that confidence that she has is remarkable and incredible. And her ability to be a woman in situations where people are like, you can't know anything by dint of your being a woman, and I think, she's an incredibly powerful character, obviously very flawed, but also never mind. What did I say? Fish Mom did nothing wrong.
one thing, just one.
Her political awareness is an amazing thing when she walks into the room and is thinking about what every whisper means and what that guy's eye twitch means. It reminds me of the opening of The Age of Innocence when they're in the opera and the one guy has his opera glasses, goes in really class, just like observing everybody and all their little intricacies. Like Catelyn has just that sense of public political awareness that clearly comes just from years hanging out with all these people and just learning them. And so I think that always comes through really strongly. I think that is something I would like to have, but don't.
Yeah, she could read a room really, really well.
Yeah.
I would really like to be able to do that. And I walk into rooms with people sometimes and go like, I don't quite have the skill to dissect the room as I would like to. So I envy Catelyn that.
Yeah, that's something to aspire to for sure.
Whenever we walk back into rooms again, whenever that's a thing.
That'll be nice. Let's start on the ground floor, right? Like,
exactly.
SKNC says, if you want to read a fantasy story where Mance is the protagonist, you can read The King Killer Chronicle by Patrick Rothfuss.
No, thank you. And next question.
An accurate description, for better or for worse. But again, what makes Mance interesting is that he's not the protagonist. So having a guy like him be the protagonist, I think, is for me less interesting. Mance is interesting, like from a distance with the camera right here, Mance over here. That's why he's interesting.
Yeah,
Patrick Rothfuss.
I have a lot of friends who love those books, and I appreciate how much joy and enjoyment they bring people.
Wow, that's underrated. Yeah.
I read it as an audiobook. I think I started it after my movie. Yeah. And at a certain point I was like, well, either I'm gonna stop or I'm going to throw my iPod out the window of this bus. So
you made the sensible choice.
I'm going to keep my iPod and just listen to anything else, because that character was so unbearably annoying, and I could not, like, I get it. Yeah, it's the point. Fine, it doesn't matter. I couldn't handle it.
Yeah, there's a narcissistic ego loop to that series.
Yeah, I get the feeling like the author's talking about himself, and it's just like, oof, whatever.
I appreciate the structure of it really well, but yeah, tone-wise, it's not for me.
All right. Mubarak M says, this is a question for McCall. What is your ranking of the 5 published books of A Song of Ice and Fire? And this is for all the marbles.
Pass. I don't rank stuff.
Number 1. Yeah. What's your favorite?
Oh, you guys you're gonna like kick me out for being so basic. Probably Storm of Swords.
Nothing wrong with that. Storm is beloved for a reason.
Yeah. I just have very vivid memories reading that book. Also the Blackwater scenes with Santa and the Hounds in Clash of Kings. But I'm really not an Ironborn fan. So Clash.
I know this. Hey! I understand that everyone is wrong except me. It's just a burden I must bear.
No, listen, you can like. I actually really admire people who can like the parts of the story that are like deliberately boring and underdone. Like people who really like Dorne, and they just see stuff there that I do not see, and I'm just like, Ariane keeps whining. I'm gonna throw her out the window of the tower myself.
Hey,
and
not allowed.
Ariane, you're talking about.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, it's fine. So I'm curious, a follow-up question. So you just finished a linear reread of A Song of Ice and Fire. Were there things that like kind of stuck out to you and like doing it in a linear fashion than doing it in a published fashion or chapter fashion?
So I didn't do the entire reread with everyone. I kind of skipped through and did different chapters. But when we were doing clusters of chapters that were wildly out of order, it was really always interesting how they did fit together. Like there were a lot of times when it was like these chapters are not concurrent at all, and yet they're still talking. A lot of like the Jon and Dany scenes, chapters, like in Clash of Kings and Storm of Swords, would have surprising similarities and ideas about power that weren't necessarily, you wouldn't pick up on them necessarily. I mean, you would, I guess, thematically, but the specifics of them were really interesting to study right next to each other. It was a really interesting. I mean, the timeline is bullshit, if you ask me. But it was a really interesting way to read the series, and also a really interesting look at George's pacing, because like Bina, who was leading it, kept being like, okay, so a year ago, so Brienne has moved about 6 feet in the past 6 months, and a year ago, Renly was alive. So like, the idea that the books have exploded as the timeline has contracted it was a very interesting.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. George talked about how when he had A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons merged as like this idea was to have like a Jon, Dany, and then a Cersei chapter. So like he was like intentionally paralleling these 3 characters. That's one of the things he felt like he lost with the when he split the 2 books by point of views and by location. So I think it's a deliberate on George's part, which I think is a good thing that you guys were able to pull out of that. But adding Cersei in there would just be wild. I think if you can, I mean, we won't do this for the Nauticast, but I think for you guys who are interested in reading that, like reading like Jon 1, Dany 1, Cersei 1, like in kind of that like order, would just kind of expose some of George's ideas about power and how to use or misuse power.
That's a great point. I've always felt like, that's definitely, you can find such strong connections there. But part of me also goes like, man, the Cersei chapters just tone-wise are so different from the Jon and Dany chapters. Like the Jon and Dany chapters, like we're taking power seriously. We're struggling. Like I got angels and devils within me. What do I do? And the Cersei chapters is like, okay, so here's what we're doing today. And it's just like the tone is just completely different. And I love them for that. But that's why, as much as the combined order was great, Feast, I love Feast for itself because it just has that energy to it. The Ironborn chapters too. Again, that's why I love it, because the Ironborn chapters are all these stodgy little assholes just going and then Euron goes up like, so when I was on the stars this morning, just completely different energy.
Oh my god, I literally never thought about it like that, but I feel like every POV in Feast is on something.
True.
Brienne's on benzos. Cersei's on coke. Like, oh my god, you're totally right.
They're on psychedelics. Yeah. Exactly.
This is hilarious.
The Dornish have their own stuff. It's mostly pepper based.
Asha's drunk the whole time.
That's true. She is. She'd have to be.
Yeah. Oh well. Oh, I guess she's actually in. Is she in Feast? Can't even remember.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Yeah, it's the weird thing. The Ironborn storyline in Feast is so much like Euron, Aeron, Victarion, and then Asha is also there. That is kind of a weird thing because her story ends up, much more in dance.
Yeah.
The one chapter, right? The Kraken's daughter is her.
Yes.
One chapter that she has.
She gets a badass Queen's mid speech though. That's always fun.
True.
She
does.
True. Oh, I love reading that thing.
Turnips and the pine cones and whatnot. It's good stuff. Good stuff.
That's good. People are begging for you to make a gift of you doing the cocaine as Cersei.
I'm sure I'll do it again at some point for you.
Yeah,
just every Cersei chapter starts with she's gonna go, I love Neil Peart from Rush so much. I go hang out in the bathroom for a while, but we're gonna talk about Rush more when I get back out, okay, buddy? Every Cersei chapter.
Yeah, Victarion, Samir says Vic is actually sober but still holds his own. Victarion is only sober because he's literally not smart enough to find anything.
Right.
I love it. Euron gives him the shade of the evening one point and Victarion just spits it out. I love imagining him sitting there tripping, getting like, I'm uncomfortable. That's not what that actually is. Victarion is on whey protein from Clint. Yeah, that's great. Yes, that's true. Yeah, the camera pans to a series of larger and larger protein shakes behind
steroids
the counter, ending in like a syringe.
Just have to have him shaking it at some point, like have a shaker cup there. Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Euron making fun of the size of his balls. It's a whole thing.
Oh my god.
Whole thing in that family.
Wow. Sasha says, I like Dorne because it's a unique setting and I read for settings first and foremost. I feel conflicted about the Ironborn section because I so strongly love, hate, am, or want to be each of them.
Beautifully put, Sasha. I mean, look, I love the Ironborn chapters as being like the slow realization of what Euron is and what he's done to these people on the way towards becoming what he ultimately is, and just like the claw marks he's left behind on his brothers and how they've tried to deal with it and can't. And I love that aspect of it. But yeah, Sasha makes a good point. Yeah, sometimes, you read things. Sometimes you read things for a character. Sometimes you read things for the setting, and sometimes you read things for the integration. I like a lot of aspects of the Dornish story and Feast, but it does very much feel like George trying to make them more of a bigger deal than they were very, 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 very quickly, and skipping over some stuff in the process.
Yeah, and look, I mean, Dorne is way more feminist than the rest of the Seven Kingdoms, so like, props to them. And it's a low bar again, but listen, girls can inherit that of itself is just
for sure. It just sometimes feel like Dorne sometimes feel less like a lived-in place where that's true, and more like a place where George dumps the idea of being progressive. Like down there, that's where they're progressive. I'm not going to do much with that, but that's where they are. If you're interested, folks. So that does come off a little, But what are you going to do?
I agree there. All right, we'll do, I guess, 2 more questions, you think? And then we'll probably call it for nights. It's been a lot of fun, especially the cocaine that's been flowing in this podcast tonight.
Not like
Jeff is sweating.
Drugs. Anyways, Maina Tyrell asks, George R. Martin said that Arya will get her period soon. How do y'all think that will affect her? And how do you think that'll mirror contrast with Sansa? So this is something that George said at Balticon in 2016, whereas I can't remember the exact...
soon, guys.
What's up?
Find soon.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Any day now.
Next week.
Interesting, interesting question. You know, when you look at how George handles her sexuality in Mercy, it's pretty clear he still wishes she was 16.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I'm curious how he's going to handle a part of the story that he initially planned to skip over.
Yeah, and I think like part of the answer is tied to Gendry, because he said in the same answer, I want to say that I will revisit Gendry and Arya again, and Arya will get her period soon. So I'm thinking that's probably somewhat related, right?
Oh God, she'll get her period at the sight of him. He's just so manly. Again, that's the thing that's unironically in bad fantasy novels. That's the bar we're working from. He was so lovely, I became a woman on the spot. Like, I've read that in terrible, terrible novels. So hopefully that's not that.
Yeah. I don't know, because Arya is like, who is it affecting? Is it affecting Mercy? Is it affecting Arya? Is it affecting no one? Is it, you know, like it's very much going to depend on what headspace she's in. You know, I'm sure that the House of Black and White, for all of their protestations against, you know, we don't usually have women here, have plenty of material that they can, you know, use to deal with that. Probably they would even be able to give her the option of not having her period, but I don't know if George wants to go into that.
Probably not.
I don't know. I do think it would be an interesting contrast with Sansa. I do really like it when George plays off those things that they have in common. Sure. That they can't, you know, the gorgeousness of both of them trying to take Catelyn's name and then splitting it in half is just
like that's just a great way of capturing to be a kid.
Exactly.
Separated from your parent, you each get half.
And having that connection kind of in spite of themselves is really beautiful. So those things that link them, I find really beautiful. So if he does that, that's great. But, you know,
I like what you're saying about the different identities and how, like, you know, the where that shell game falls apart is the body. Like, you can call yourself whatever name you want to, but that's your body. And if it's bleeding, whoever you are, whoever you call yourself that day has to deal with it.
Yeah.
Agreed there. All right. Just lots of people just talking about all of the things we're saying at this. I'm trying to find a question here. Chloe did ask me if I'm not going to read that question, Chloe.
What is it?
She asked me if breast milk tastes like rum.
Wow, this has been fun. Good night, guys.
No. Anyways, next, moving on.
It depends is the proper answer.
Woo!
Proceeding.
Oh God. Okay. All right, good one to end on. Guilty Undertaker asks, who's more annoying, a Clash of Kings Theon or a Feast for Crows Arianne? A Clash of Kings Theon by a fucking mile.
Yeah, I think he steps beyond annoying at a certain point. But yeah, I mean, Theon, you know, is just the layers of like daggers pointing inward in his POV is just, it can be really hard to read in a good way. So yeah, no, definitely Theon.
I mean, I break this down to two elements. Which one of them feels bad for themselves and shouldn't, and which one of them is killing people and shouldn't. Both of those are Theon. So Brienne. Oh, Arianne. I'm sorry. Still Arianne. Yeah. I mean, well, I'm so used to people shitting on Brienne's POV.
No, I get it.
I mean, also there's just less of Arianne. Like there just is.
True. You're left to linger with Theon much more so.
Yeah, and it doesn't pay off nearly as well. Like, you know, her early chapters from wins that we've had. Like I'm getting that I'm supposed to be feeling this huge catharsis. I'm not really, but like, and obviously Theon's arc is gorgeous and seminal in the genre and literature and all that. But
in large part because so much of it happens, you know, off screen. You know, the big jump between Clash and Dance makes them both so much better than actually seeing the intervening space would have been.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that Arianne is. I mean, I find some catharsis in Arianne's early wins chapters and her, and her final Feast for Crows chapters where Dorne and her confront each other about their misconceptions about what the other is doing. I do find that cathartic, even though I think Arianne's going to kind of take the wrong lessons from Dora Martell, but that's something we'll cover. I'm assuming we get to a Feast for Crows. So
it's fine. She's going to get grayscale anyway.
Wow.
I get catharsis out of it, but not like they've discovered the truth, because Doran and Ariana pretty clearly just recreated a larger trap around themselves without even realizing it. That catharsis, I get that aspect of Dorn, where the first sentence is the blood oranges are well past ripe, and Dorn doesn't realize he's describing his entire plan and his entire family. I love that aspect of Dorn, where it's like you go and you go, oh, this is gonna all fall apart horribly. Oh no, and you read Quentin's chapters and you go, oh no. I love that structure. A lot of the details don't hold up to vast scrutiny, but that overall structure is something I actually really like.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Finally did. Quaith 14 says, first time you're not on your live cast, I never realized that Jeff was such a Chad. Thank you, I guess. Is that a good thing or bad thing?
I'm pretty sure it's not the first one.
I think if you even use the Chad virgin dichotomy, I think you probably already lost, Jeff. I think the only winning
I was not the one
to play.
I was not the one who used it.
No, of course not, sir. That was our favorite character, Quaith.
Oh my god, I suddenly just thought of Quaith coming over to Danny and being like, oh my god, Dario is such a Chad.
Oh my god, Valley Girl Quaith. Already.
If Quaith could get any worse, we suddenly have created her to be worse.
Of course, Jeff is handsome. He's a perfect red-blooded American male.
We're all handsome on the Nauticast podcast. That's why we do this.
That's true.
People listen to us for our looks.
You got a face for radio, kid.
All right, guys. Well, it's 11 o'clock on the Eastern Seaboard, and I think a lot of us have to go to bed, I guess. All of us have to go to bed at some point. Yeah, sleep.
I do have to stare at the ceiling for several hours thinking about everything. Oh, wait, sleep. Yeah, that's what I mean. Sleep.
Well, this has been an amazing time. We appreciate everyone tuning in and chatting with us for the past hour. So it's really a lot of fun, and we really appreciate you guys tuning in week to week. And thank you so much to McCall for sticking around till 11 o'clock at night and being so awesome to come in and answer questions and chat with people and stuff like that. It's a lot of fun.
I'm getting all my Ice and FireCon energy just from this.
I feel that. I wish I'd missed that too, but it's a wonderful thing to have everyone around each other in whatever ways we can. So
yeah,
thank you so much for coming on.
No, thank you. I loved it.
Yeah, it's great. So it's so much fun, and we really appreciate you guys all tuning in and everything like that week to week and listening and everything like that. So it's awesome. It's a lot of fun. And we got the Forsaken coming up soon for you guys who are patrons. So stay tuned for that. I start reading rereading the Ironborn chapters. Emma's already ahead of me, as is often always the case for the Nauticast podcast.
Oh, hush. I don't have children. It's easy for me to jump ahead on things.
That's true.
You have cats.
I have cats. Yes, that's the very clear equivalence.
You do have children.
They take just as much of my time and energy.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys in 1 week from today. Bye.
Bye, guys. Thank you.